I grew up in a very small town in Montana. During Halloween one year, my brother and I sold lemonade by the side of the road because it was unusually hot that year. We didn't make a lot of money, but we did have a lot of fun selling lemonade to people who were passing by. So my brother and I were standing at our lemonade stand when we noticed an old, rusty car pass by us 2 or 3 times. At the time, it struck me as a little creepy. Eventually, the car slowed down and stopped right in front of the stand. There was a woman in the passenger seat, and she rolled her window down. I saw she was really skinny with gray hair, and it was stained and silky. It looked like it was nasty, honestly. I couldn't see the man who was driving very well because he never looked at me. He just stared straight ahead. Both of them seemed very odd, and their clothes were old and dirty. The lady smiled. "You boys out here selling lemonade all by yourselves?" asked the woman. "Yeah, my mom lets us," I replied. "Is your mom home?" she asked. "Yeah, she's in the house," I said. The woman turned and looked at the man who was driving. He nodded, still staring straight ahead. The woman turned back to me and said, "Okay, I'll have some lemonade." "That'll be 25 cents, I said as I poured her glass. She rummaged around in her purse, and I could hear coins clinking. Then she pulled out a $5 bill and held it to me. A chill went down my spine. Why was she handing me a $5 bill if she had coins in her purse? Something just didn't feel right. So I lied and said I don't have any change. She said, "You can keep the change. Just come and take the $5. Something felt very wrong, but $5 was a lot to me at the time. I walked up to the car and reached out to take the $5 from her hand. As soon as my fingers touched it, the woman suddenly grabbed me by my wrist and began pulling me into the car. I screamed so loud, my brother ran to the house yelling for help. The man floored the accelerator, and the car lurched forward. I fought with all my might and managed to wrench myself free from her grasp. The car stopped, and the man got out, but I was already running for my life. My brother was pounding on the door and screaming. My mother rushed out and turned just in time to see the rusty old car speeding away. We told my mom what had happened, and she called the police. When my brother and I calmed down and went back to the lemonade stand, there was a $5 bill lying on the ground. We packed up the lemonade stand and put it away for good. The year was 2018. I love Halloween more than most. As a child, I loved it. As an adult, even more. In 2015, I started to go trick-or-treating again in my neighborhood. As a short adult, and using a concealing costume, I'm a woman. I was able to do it year after year without incident, until 2018. That year, I used my favorite costume, a homemade zombie outfit with a skull mask. For the record, by this time I was over 30, but trick-or-treating was fun for me. My childhood neighborhood was too rough to trick-or-treat in. Anyway, I've been out for over 2 hours going house to house, getting lots of goodies. By this time, I was sweating pretty heavily, forcing me to pause and dry under my mask occasionally. Soon I rounded a street corner and passed a man walking 2 dogs. The street was clear, and many houses were unlit. I took a few steps forward and paused. Suddenly, standing in a house's pathway was an old lady. Where exactly did she come from? She wasn't there before. She looked to be in her mid-70s, with white hair, a sweater, a skirt, low-heeled shoes. She smiled as she approached me, standing in front of me. She said, "Hello, dear. Are you out trick-or-treating? Come with me and I'll get you some candy." I said to her, "Thank you, but I don't have to." She chuckled warmly like I said something funny. "Nonsense. Come with me and we'll get you some candy, sweetie." For some reason, I decided to follow her. As we walked together, I suddenly realized something. My shoes made noise as we walked, while hers didn't make any noise. 2 houses down, she paused and said, "Go on, dear. I'll wait here for you." I did the trick-or-treat routine, then turned to thank her. I froze in shock. The old woman was no longer standing there. There's no way she could have left without me hearing her. I asked the man in the doorway if he'd seen her. Puzzled, he asked, "Her? You came alone. There's no one with you." Confused, I said, "I must have been seeing things." I walked home wondering what had happened. After 10 minutes, I stopped in my tracks and chuckled to myself, saying to myself, "Holy crap, I just saw a ghost." My name is Brent, and this happened when I was 11 years old, when I lived in a somewhat sketchy neighborhood. This took place on Halloween with a friend of mine named Carlos. Me and Carlos were best friends since the 2nd grade, and there was a 2-story house rumored to be haunted near us. We decided that it would be a good idea to test out the rumor, which had seemed obviously fake to us at the time, or so we thought it had been fake. We went trick-or-treating and then left our candy at my friend Carlos's house. It was close to midnight, which was the time we intended to be at the house, to make things a little scarier due to the fact that we love horror movies. It took us a while to get to the house, as it was a few houses away, and it was the second to the last house on the street. As we arrived at the house at around 11:56, me and my friend Carlos then thought it would be a good idea to trick-or-treat here, so we rung the doorbell. A man which looked to be in his mid-30s, dressed with a hoodie and ripped jeans, answered the door almost right away. My friend then mentioned the rumor of his house being haunted. We laughed it out, and he used a poor excuse which we bought at the time, which was that he was a very messy and unorganized man. He then said, "You kids are almost a little late for Halloween. It's going to end in 2 minutes. It's almost 12 a.m. He said the candy was in the room and he offered us to come in. Us being really anxious at the time, took the offer to not be rude. We sat in the living room on the couch, waiting for the man as he went upstairs. Carlos's mom then texted him to ask if we were going to have a sleepover that night, which he replied with yes, as the man was coming back. He insisted on us going upstairs because he had Reese's, which was my favorite candy at the time. So me being a pretty mindless 11-year-old, I took the offer. As we went upstairs and into his hardly lit up room, it appeared as if the man collected knives. We saw it as a pretty cool hobby, and the man gave us each 2 Reese's chocolates. We then thanked the man. As we were going downstairs, my friend Carlos fell down the stairs screaming in pain. I turned around and the man was holding what appeared to be a red knife, which was probably one of the ones from his collection. My fight or flight was immediately activated and I punched the man in the face. He stabs my leg, but I managed to hold on in pain and knock him out with 5 punches. I take the knife out of my leg and start limping away holding Carlos, and we get out. I call the police and they arrest the man a while after he wakes up. The ambulance takes me and Carlos to the hospital. I was fine after 2 days, but Carlos was apparently stabbed twice in the back and was bleeding out. He took about a week or 2 in the hospital to recover. A while after getting out of the hospital, the police told us about the man's past. He was a registered sex offender. I never again went inside a stranger's house, and to this day I fear what could have happened if I was not able to hold on in pain from being stabbed. On Halloween, when I was in the 4th grade, I stayed home sick from school. I was lying on the couch watching Hocus Pocus when I heard the doorbell ringing. It was the postman. He told me I had a package to deliver, but it was so big that he needed me to help him carry it in. I don't know why, but I knew something wasn't right. I didn't see his truck parked out front, and when I asked him where it was, he told me it was around the corner. I asked him why the regular postman wasn't here, and he said he was visiting family. He kept telling me to open the front door. I said I was sick and I wasn't allowed to leave the house. I told him my parents would pick up the package from the post office, but he said that would be too much hassle, and told me my mom would want me to take the package now. I told him I had to get my shoes first, and then I would come out and help him. Then I closed the front door, locked it, and ran to the back door and locked that one too. I called our neighbor, who was a close family friend, and begged her to come over to my house right now. Then I stood at the front window and stared at the man. When he saw me, he yelled through the door asking if I found my shoes yet. I yelled back, telling him that I called my neighbor to come and help carry the package because she was older and stronger. At that point, he just turned around and ran off. They never caught the guy, and I always wonder if he ever managed to trick some other kid. The story took place about a year ago. Me and my 3 friends, Saul, Fernando, and AJ, decided to take a trip to Universal Studios for the yearly event, Halloween Horror Nights event. The trip to our destination was not too long, so we got there in about 2 hours or so. When we got there, it was full of guests, but we managed to enjoy the rest of the day and got to go through different attractions and mazes. The theme park was set to close at 2 a.m., so we started heading back to our town. We took the ramp to the freeway and began our way back once again. I was so tired from walking all day, we were all falling asleep, except for my friend Fernando, of course. He was the driver. 1 hour on the road and we decided to stop at a nearby Denny's off the freeway. We went inside, ordered food, and ate. It was all normal once again. A few guests were still eating too, and it was almost 3 a.m. We finished our meals, paid, and went out the door to the parking lot. As we stepped outside, I noticed a strange man standing next to a car across from ours. He just looked like he was staring blankly at us. From what I could see was that he was wearing a trench coat. As we were about to get into the car, the man started walking slowly toward us. And there I could notice a long scar across his face. Suddenly my friend Saul asked the man, "Yo, did you lose something?" The stranger stood there with an evil-like smile and slowly started taking a knife out of his pocket. We all hurried back into the car and told our friend Fernando to floor it. As we were exiting the parking lot, I turned my head back and noticed that the guy was still standing there waving his knife at us. I'm just thankful that this story didn't end up worse, because God knows what plans that man had. Honestly, that was just a weird experience. My name is Eric, and this happened to me when I was around 7 or 8 years old. One summer, my dad took me to a campsite for a long weekend. When we arrived, there were some kids around my age playing in a small park. I looked at my dad and he said, "Go ahead." So my dad unpacked the car and I went to maybe make some friends. There were 2 boys in a small park. I said hello and they said hello back. Their names were Kevin and Graham. Graham had to go shortly after because his parents were calling for him. So Kevin and I hung around and we talked about things we liked and how long we were staying at the campsite. After about an hour, Kevin's mom was calling for him, so we had to leave. I was about to head back to my dad when a boy appeared from the woods. He said hello. I said hi back. He introduced himself as Daniel. He seemed like a nice kid and we got along pretty well. He asked me if I wanted to play hide and seek, so I said yes. We played hide and seek at the campsite for maybe 45 minutes until I told him I had to go, so I went back to my dad and went to the camper. I told my dad I had made some friends and my dad asked where their campers were. I told him where Kevin and Graham's were, but I never asked where Daniel was. I thought maybe, well, I'll see him the next day and I'll ask him then. So the next day I went outside to see if any of the kids wanted to play. Kevin and Graham were both unavailable. I was about to just return back to my camper when Daniel appeared out of nowhere, out the woods. We greeted each other, and I asked him if he wanted to play hide and seek again. He said yeah, but he said we should play at his house. I asked him where his house was, and he told me it's not far, it's just through the woods. I followed Daniel in the woods toward his house. We were walking for ages, and one thing that I found unusual was the more we walked, the less talkative and distant Daniel became. Eventually, we exited the woods, and Daniel said, "Here we are." He pointed at a rundown old house with a white van parked beside it. He started walking toward it. I slowly followed and asked Daniel, "So this is your house?" He replied by saying, "Yeah, let's go play hide and seek." I got this bad feeling. and it became worse the closer we got to the house. It didn't look like a normal house. I started to notice that there were people standing by the windows inside the house. I asked Daniel if that was his dad in the window, and he said, yeah. Don't worry about him. He's harmless. And just continued walking. I don't know what it was, but something made me slow down. Daniel was by the front door at this point, and when he turned around and asked me if I was coming, I told him I had to go. I turned around and ran through the forest and back to my camper. I spent the next few hours watching TV. Then I got bored and decided to go back outside. I knocked on Graham's door, but he wasn't available. I knocked on Kevin's door, and his dad told me he was already out with some boy named Daniel. So I went back to the camper and did something else with my time. Late that night, there was a knock on our door. It was Kevin's parents. They asked if we had seen Kevin anywhere, as he's been gone for hours. I asked his mom if she had checked Daniel's house, and she said no because she didn't know where Daniel lived. I showed Kevin's parents along with my dad and a few other people through the woods to Daniel's house. When we got there, the van was gone. And when we knocked on the door, there was no answer. And the whole house was empty and abandoned. We didn't find Kevin for the rest of our time at the campsite, and he's still missing to this day as far as I know. I thought then, and still think today, that Daniel was some kind of bait to lure kids in the same age as him to be kidnapped. And I'm thankful my gut sensed danger and told me to leave. My name is Jack, and growing up, my younger brother and I, who's 2 years younger than me, had a complicated and somewhat difficult childhood. I won't go too much into details, private and personal, but there were a lot of occasions where my brother and I, whose name is Brian, would move around the country a lot and live with different relatives and sometimes friends. This one time, I think I was about 10 and Brian was 8. Our dad was driving us across the country for a reason I can't remember. I don't know what time it was, but I know it was dark and late. When we finally stopped for the night at a motel, it was even darker. After checking into our room, which was on the ground floor, our dad said he was leaving to do something and he'll be back soon. He said he'll bring back a pizza and told us to not leave the room. There was nothing to do in our room and we didn't know how to work the TV, so I suggested that we play hide and seek. Brian was to be the seeker. I left the room and ran upstairs to the floor above us, around the corner behind an ice machine, and waited. I had a clear view over the motel and could see Brian looking around for me. I remember standing behind the ice machine giggling and watching my brother walk around the motel in the pool area looking for me. Then the door behind me slowly creaked open, revealing a large man that looked to be in his late 40s. Had a dirty white tank top on, and he seemed overweight. He asked me in a friendly voice what I was doing. I told him I was just playing hide and seek. He then asked me if I was playing with my parents. I told him no, just my younger brother. At this point, Brian was upstairs and found me talking to the man. The man asked if our parents knew we were playing hide and seek. Brian spoke up and said no, our dad left us. The man then asked Brian and I if we wanted to come inside to watch cartoons, and he had some cookies and milkshakes for us as well. Me and Brian looked at each other and then looked back at the man and said, okay. And we entered the man's motel room. We sat down on the bed and the man turned the TV on, and he put on some cartoons. I can't remember what cartoons it was though. He then said he would be right back and was going to get our milkshakes and cookies. The man went into the bathroom. I got up and I took a look into the bathroom to see what the man was doing. I was confused at why he didn't go in the kitchen. He had 2 glasses of water and then put a little bit of white powder in each glass. Thinking at the time it was just the ingredients to make a milkshake, I sat back down on the bed. When the man finally came out of the bathroom, he handed me and Brian a glass each. He said, "Here's your milkshakes." It didn't look like milkshakes at all. At least not one that I've ever had. It looked like it was just water with white powder floating around. I suddenly had this bad feeling in the pit of my stomach telling me I was definitely in danger and we needed to leave. Brian was about to take a sip of his drink. I stopped him, and the man was still watching us, just silent. Out of nowhere, The man just asked us, "What's wrong? Drink your milkshake." This time in a much less friendlier tone than he had been speaking to us before. I looked at the man, and he was looking at me, waiting for me to speak. I then said, "We always eat cookies first before we drink our milkshakes." The man let out an irritated sigh and went back into the bathroom. I put the glass down on the floor and quietly did the same with Brian's. I grabbed Brian's arm and quickly exited the man's room. We ran around the corner and down the stairs into our motel room. I turned out the lights and I kept watch out the window. After about 5 minutes, the man came down the stairs and started his car. I was feeling a bit of a relief, thinking he was just about to leave the motel. But he got out of the car and looked directly at the window I was looking through and started approaching our room. I remember panicking at the moment, thinking that the man was about to take us. He was getting closer to our door when our dad pulled up and asked the guy what he was doing. The man didn't say anything and just walked away and went to his car and drove off. We never saw him again. When our dad asked us who that man was, we told him we didn't know. Brian and I never spoke about this incident again to anyone. I sometimes have nightmares about if we did drink that man's drink and what would have happened to us if we did, or if our dad didn't come back in time.
When my grandfather was younger, he became the principal of an elementary school. He was in his late 20s, early 30s at the time, and despite being young, he was a born leader. He was a great principal and everyone loved him. I can attest to that as I attended multiple award ceremonies for him, and the respect and admiration he received was crazy. There was a young boy at the school who was having behavioral issues in class, and my grandfather saw that the kid didn't have a lot of parental support. So he called in his father and had talked with him about spending more time with his son in just a general parenting session. It turned out that all the boy needed was his dad's attention, and after a few weeks, he was a happy model student. Whenever my grandfather would leave school late, he would see the dad was playing basketball with his son after he got home from work. It was one of those moments that he took pride in, being able to make a difference in people's lives. However, not everything had such an easy solution, and my grandfather found himself having to deal with an employee, Stanley the janitor, who was showing up to work drunk. Stanley was an alcoholic with a mean streak, and my grandfather tried on multiple occasions to deal with his behavior. Finally, one day Stanley showed up so drunk that my grandfather sent him home and called the superintendent to let him know he was going to be firing him the next morning after he sobered up. He then warned them to let him deal with it when Stanley was sober, because he was not a stable person. As it goes in these kinds of stories, the superintendent was furious and decided that he was going to call Stanley himself and fire him despite my grandfather's warning. No one called my grandfather to tell him about it either, so he was completely in the dark and thought he could deal with it in the morning. Stanley was furious and went to the school that evening. He searched the offices, my grandfather's included, and tore things apart until he finally had what he wanted. He was in a blaze of fury, and on his way out, he saw the father and his son playing basketball. He walked towards them and pulled something out of his trousers. It was a gun. He then proceeded to shoot the little boy, killing him instantly. The father was so upset, was hysterically crying, but somehow managed to get the gun away from Stanley and shoot him. My grandfather was called to the elementary school immediately by the police because there were 2 dead bodies. The little boy and Stanley were dead. What was even worse was the crying from the father and him saying that he couldn't save his son. It was clear that he could never forgive himself for that day. My grandfather was pulled aside by one of the police who had searched Stanley for evidence. They had found a hit list of people that he was going to kill, and all the addresses of those people that he had retrieved when he searched the offices. My grandfather was number 1 on that list. So, if it weren't for that father, it's likely that I would never been able to meet my grandfather, and possibly my mother and grandmother would have been killed if Stanley had been able to complete his mission. To this day, I get goosebumps whenever I hear that story, and it's just so chilling. My grandfather never uttered a single word about this after his initial recount, and my mother made me swear to never tell him I knew. He carried the weight of that boy's death on him until the day he died.
So, when I was young, I went to that one house in the town where the residents went all out and probably spent thousands of dollars getting the place perfect for Halloween. Now, this place was insanely well done, and I mean really freaking good. Albeit, even as an adult, it competed with professional haunted houses. I believe the year was either 1999 or 2000 because I went as Darth Maul. I remember being literally scared out of my mind the previous few years, and I hoped my badass character would provide me with some sort of courage. They blocked off the scene with a black tarp and had everything you could ever want to see at such a house. A psycho shower scene with a zombie crawling out of a toilet, ghouls and imps climbing the tree, blood, gore, strobes, fog, everything. I remember feeling terrified, even with my double lightsaber. Even though I was scared to death to walk through it, I always admired the workmanship, as I knew that the props they had were either really expensive or took some good effort to make. To this day, I've never seen a better yard than that. As always, every year, I saw the house owners sitting on their porch reveling in the terror they brought to the neighborhood and handing out candy. So, I nervously crossed the yard past flying banshees and impaled corpses. I noticed the main attraction at the end of the line. There, on what I guess was probably the driveway, was the bottomless pit attraction. The illusion bewildered and chilled me, and though it was only lit by the lone light bulb, it made the box glow like a low-burning furnace. I must have stared at it for a while when I suddenly heard a cough and a low hushed voice to my right. I don't really remember what was said, but I want to say it sounded something like, "Hey, check this out," or "Hey, I want to show you something," in a gruff and horsey kind of tone. I looked over and at first saw nothing but the wide gate to what was clearly the side of the owner's house. There was just a faint amount of light from the glowing pit to illuminate the outlines of the gated fence. After adjusting my eyes, I noticed a figure standing completely still. In fact, it was so still, I remember thinking it was just another static prop. My young mind just didn't register a lot of this, and was still looking for the voice I heard, not realizing it had come from the figure who I could still only barely make out. After a few moments, I heard the voice again. I realized it had come from the figure and began to approach it. This was obviously a stupid idea, but in comparison to everything else that was happening around me, this figure seemed anything but imposing. So I cautiously approached the figure, trying to make sense of it. Suddenly, the figure began to move, and consequently, I froze solid. The light from the amber glow lit up its face just enough for me to make out its features. This I do remember clearly. It was a scraggly and rough-looking man with a coarse grey beard and yellowed teeth. His weathered and tattered clothing looked like it hadn't been cleaned in ages. He was smiling at me, though I had no idea why, but it unsettled me greatly under the hellish glow of the light bulb behind me. It all felt wrong. It was as if at that moment I had acquired some clarity and realized his presence here obviously was not part of the show. And considering I already also saw the owners, he clearly did not belong on the property. I screamed and ran out of there as fast as I could to the exit, not looking behind for a second. I probably got a few looks from the other kids around us, but as soon as I found my parents waiting outside, I told them about the man I saw. I saw one of the owners approach and ask if everything was alright. I said something like, I didn't like the old man by the gate. He looked at me for a second and went, "What man?" I never went back there, ever again. Number 2. Several years ago, right before I was about to leave for trick-or-treating on Halloween, I got into a fight with my mum. I had told her I was going to pick up a friend and go out with that friend, but my mum insisted I had an adult with me. I raged, thinking it would be too embarrassing to have to follow around an adult like a child. I was old enough to look after myself, or at least I thought so. After the episode with my mum, I ran to my room, enraged that she would do that to me. However, instead of obeying her, I devised a plan to get what I wanted. My younger brother and sister were going to go trick-or-treating with my mum and my mum's friend and her son. I decided that I would tell my mum I was sorry for lashing out and that I was going to stay home and pass out candy. Then, after she left with my siblings, I was going to go out like I had planned. I had planned it perfectly too. I knew what time they were going to come back home. I knew what route they were going to take, and I congratulated myself for my cunning plan. After my family left, I got together my costume. I was going as a gangster, which was probably the worst thing I could have done, but I was blinded by my excitement to realize my mistake. My mind went wild with all the things I could do now that my parents were gone. I could really live. I got so deep into this idea of being on my own that I decided I was going to trick-or-treat on my own and called my friend to tell her I was cancelling. Another huge mistake. I left the house with quite a bit of confidence in myself. The first street I went down went great. I got loads of candy and was having a great time. Once again, my excitement and confidence blinded me from the strange looks I got from being alone. I turned left down another street, my pride building with every step. I was almost at the end of the street, thinking of ways to explain all the candy I'd got to my parents, when I realized I was being followed. By the time I had come to this realization, I was at the section of the street where it was kind of out in the open, no trees between the sidewalk and the road, and I didn't see any other kids near me. There was a car, and quite a trashy one at that, following a few feet behind me. All my confidence had vanished and my hair stood on end. I glanced behind myself at the car and all the windows were down, and 3 men were in the car, all smoking cigarettes. They were glaring right at me. As soon as I caught their stare, all the warnings my mother had given me about creeps like this hit me in the head. I looked down at my gangster costume and knew I blew it. I looked like a thug. I quickly turned back around and started walking, my heart beating out of my chest. My whole body went numb, and I instantly forgot how to do everything except walk forward. I was at the last house on the street with the car still following close behind, when I made the split decision to turn up the driveway of the last house. Now, the house I turned to was completely abandoned, and had been for years. The windows were boarded up, and the front yard had been scattered in junk. Everyone in the neighbourhood knew that the house was abandoned too. The car stopped right in front of the house, and everyone inside the car was just staring directly at me. I walked up to the front porch and turned around, thanking God for the tall bushes blocking the porch from the street and blocking the creeper's view. I stood there for at least a minute, staring right back at them, knowing I wasn't going to make it. My heart thumped out of my chest, and I could hear it ringing in my ears. One of them got out of the car. He stood and looked directly at me through the bushes and into my soul. I stood holding the rusty doorknob, staring right back at him. We must have stood like that for a long 10 seconds before the man got back into the car and they peeled down the street. Once they were gone, I ran as fast as I could across the street and up the opposite direction, frantically looking for someone I knew. I spotted my brother's friend and his mother and walked right behind them until they reached my street. I got a few weird looks from my mum, but I really didn't care. I ran up to my house and cried myself to sleep. I still live in the same neighbourhood, and every time I pass the abandoned house, I silently thank it for saving my life. I don't know why the creeps didn't come after me, as they likely knew that the house was also abandoned.
This upcoming Halloween will be my 40th birthday, and even after nearly 25 years, the terrifying memory of that night has never faded. You see, I lost my virginity in a pumpkin patch on Halloween. I know, cliché. Specifically, I lost it in the bed of a pickup truck while it was parked in the pumpkin patch. To give you an idea, the patch was maybe 80 by 100 feet, and fenced off by wire mesh to prevent cows from getting in. The truck was parked just inside the only gate. Myself and my date had settled there right before the sun went down. My house was just across the street from the pumpkin patch. We shared a bottle of wine, awkwardly talked for a while, and then got to business. My family had 2 border collies, and as we were changing positions, the dogs wandered in and started barking at us. My date and I paused and drunkenly, playfully, began throwing scraps of food out into the pumpkins for them to chase. After a couple of minutes of that, we continued where we left off. After we were done, we sat there in the truck and looked up at the stars, while the dogs wandered around sniffing random things. After a short while, I saw my father return home, pulling into the driveway across the street. The dogs bounded out of the patch towards him, and me and my date quickly began to dress ourselves. Once we were fully clothed, we just sat on the tailgate and kept talking as we watched my dad pet the dogs and go into the house. It was about then that we heard it. A rustling sound coming from the patch somewhere behind us. We both paused and turned. At this point, there was only moonlight to illuminate our surroundings, but it was enough. And this is exactly what we saw. A single pumpkin began to rise up out of the patch, but not like someone was lifting it. It was kind of sideways, like it had been resting on its side and was now sitting up. For a split second, I thought someone was rising this pumpkin out of the patch on a stick or a metal bar. But then the stick changed position. It coiled like a snake and then shot straight up, like a man would be if he went from a squatting position to a standing position. I then saw 2 spindly legs with knee joints protruding from the thing, but no arms. There was a buzzing in my ear, and all of a sudden my date screamed. We both jumped off the truck and booked it out of the patch and sprinted towards my house. I glanced back once, and I'll swear on whatever you want me to swear on. A tall, skeletal figure was leaning over the truck where we had both been sitting, and I caught a glimpse of 2 beady red eyes staring back at me. We made it to my garage and forced our way through the kitchen door. I began screaming at my dad to get his gun. It wasn't until I saw the blood on the kitchen floor that I realized that my nose had been bleeding. Even more alarming, my date's nose was gushing blood as well. I told my dad that there was someone in the pumpkin patch, and he grabbed his gun and power walked out of the house, the dogs following closely behind him. But they stopped halfway there, refusing to come any closer to the pumpkin patch. When my dad returned, he was livid. He wanted to know what had damaged the fence, and broke the tailgate off my truck, which technically was his truck. I could only shiver in confusion and abject terror. He reported that something had knocked the tailgate right off the truck, and then tore out of the patch from inside, and destroyed a huge section of fence. I didn't sleep at all that night. I cowered in terror in the living room, with all the lights on. The next day, the police came and examined the scene. The wire fence had been torn out of the ground and dragged a short distance away. There was no clear indication of what specifically had done it. My father and the police were convinced that it was a trespasser pulling a Halloween prank. But I never believed that for a moment. I tried to explain that the dogs had been pounding through the patch minutes before the thing had appeared, and neither of them had made a sound to alert us that there was a trespasser nearby. Furthermore, the entry gate to the patch made plenty of noise whenever the wind rattled it. So if someone climbed over it, it would make even more noise, and we had been sitting right by the gate. Another thing that terrified me is the shape of the thing as it stood. Even if it was a trespasser with an elaborate costume, none of that would even begin to explain the tailgate, the destroyed fence, the nosebleeds, and our dogs being too nervous to approach the patch, or the eyes I had caught a glimpse of. My father went to his grave believing that we had been vandalized by trespassers. My date and I concluded later that whatever it was, it hadn't been human or an animal. I don't tell the story often because I mostly get the same Charlie Brown joke. It was the Great Pumpkin, so no one really takes me seriously. But I've heard that skinwalkers can take the form of anything that best suits their surroundings. Our property wasn't anywhere near a Native American reservation, but I can't think of anything else it could have been. So what do you think it was? It's been 10 years since I've spoken about this incident. On Halloween of 2009, me and my younger sister, along with a couple of friends, went out to trick-or-treat. I was only 8 years old at the time. My younger sister was 5. My best friend's older brother was 17, and it was his responsibility to look after us that night. This took place in London, and at the time, we hardly had any crimes in our area. The night went off without a hitch, and we were all planning on calling it an evening since we had collected enough candy. My best friend's older brother was just about to call my dad, but before he could dial the number, he received a call from my dad. He let him know where to come to pick us up, and after a few minutes, my dad came and collected me and my sister. We said goodbye to our friends and thanked them for the fun evening. As my dad was driving my sister and I back home, he seemed on edge. Now, since I was only 8, I kept babbling on about how much candy we had collected, and how I couldn't wait to get home to eat them. My dad wasn't listening. He just looked really anxious about something. As soon as we got back home, I entered my house to find my mother, my aunt, and my cousin sitting in the living room. I greeted them, and my mother hugged both me and my sister. My dad sat us down and told us that we could never go out trick-or-treating ever again. Now, because I was 8, I began throwing a tantrum, complaining how I loved Halloween, and my parents were being unfair. My little sister was too young to even care. She was too busy going through the candy that we had collected. So after 2009, me and my sister never went out for Halloween. We didn't bother throwing a tantrum since we knew it would be pointless. However, in 2012, my brother was born, and last year in 2018, he turned 6. My father finally relented and agreed to take my little brother and my sister out trick-or-treating. By this time, Halloween had lost its appeal for me, and I didn't want to go out anyway. My little brother gets his way since he's the youngest, and he loves Halloween. I decided to ask my mom why she didn't allow me and my sister to go out on Halloween after 2009. She sighed and explained to me that a boy from our neighborhood had gone out trick-or-treating in the same area. He was with his friends, but had somehow separated from the group. He ended up knocking on the door of an old house that was located at the end of a quiet street. I'll spare you the gory details, but the boy's body was found in that house after several people heard screaming and called the police. The boy's arm had been removed from his body, and he died from blood loss. The police had been going door to door warning parents about what happened, and that's when my dad came and collected us. My mother told me that they arrested an old, mentally deranged man in connection with the crime, but Halloween would never be the same again for my neighborhood. I had heard rumors about a boy who was killed on Halloween at my school, but I never took it seriously. I thought it was just a local urban legend. But now I understood why my dad looked so worried that night. The house where the boy was found, which is only a few blocks away from mine, now sits abandoned, with its windows boarded up. People around here jokingly refer to it as the Myers house. Halloween is pretty much ruined for me. I'll be staying home again this year. However, my brother, who's now 7, can't wait for Halloween. I just hope my dad keeps a close eye on him.
I was around that time in my life where most kids my age would stop trick-or-treating, either because they thought it was lame or because their parents told them to stop. My father and I had a similar conversation, and in the end, we decided that this trick-or-treat would be the final one. So when October 31st came, my dad helped me paint my face to look like a zombie. I figured that this costume should be simple, yet something I liked, so zombie it was. I grabbed an empty pillowcase and headed out, with my parents telling me to be back by 11ish. Before you ask, yes, I was going trick-or-treating by myself. I was able to convince my parents that I needed to get as much candy as I could, seeing as how I wouldn't be able to do this again next year. So off I went, running from house to house, shoving candy into my pillowcase as fast as I could. So by the time it got dark, my pillow was about 3/4 filled, and I had no intent on slowing down. As I'm about to walk into a new neighborhood, a black van pulls up to the curb and was about a few feet away from me. The door opens, and out of the darkness comes some guy in a hockey mask and tattered jacket, wielding a machete. He turns his head towards me, probably just trying to creep me out. "Nice Jason costume," I say, trying to be friendly as I begin to walk past him. "Thanks, zombie. You want some candy?" "I've got bags of them," he says as he pulls out his little white sacks of candy. So, I, being the idiot 14-year-old I was, opened my pillowcase and let him plop 2 or 3 sacks into it. "Make sure you eat them real soon. You'll love them," he snickered, which really sent a chill down my spine. He left as quickly as he came, but I just shrugged it off as I needed to finish trick-or-treating. I continued down the road, again going from house to house for candy. After about the 3rd or 4th house, I noticed something odd. It was the same black van from before. After every house I went to, the van would get closer and closer. At around what I could only guess was 10:30, I headed home with my sack full of candy. As I walked, the area behind me illuminated. I turned around, expecting to see a car that would soon pass me. It was the van, and in the driver's seat was the same guy who had the Jason mask on, the same guy that gave me the candy. My heart stopped, and I broke into a mad dash back to my house, the van easily keeping up with me. I was luckily able to lose him by running into the woods near my house. I exited the woods that lead to the side of my house, and I looked for the fake rock that held the spare key to our house. After I got in, I put my candy on the kitchen table and somehow found a way to go to sleep. The next morning, when I woke up, my parents were sitting at the kitchen table, digging around through the bags of candy that Jason gave me. They started asking me who and where I got the bags from, which started to freak me out. I would later learn that the bags of candy were nothing more than just a bag of prescription drugs. There was a ton of sleeping pills in them, and I finally understood his intentions. He was going to follow me until I fell asleep, and then who knows what with me after he got me in the van. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure whether or not that machete he had was fake or not. The police came up empty-handed, so I guess I'll never know his fate.
This happened on Halloween of last year. Me and a couple of buddies were out getting candy. Our neighborhood isn't exactly the safest, but it isn't the worst either. About 90 minutes into trick-or-treating, we see a house with a sign that says "Go to the van for your candy," which had an arrow pointing down to a creepy-looking black van. This house was at the end of the street, so if things did go south, it would be easy to get away fast if necessary. We go to the van, and we see a man sitting in the driver's seat. He tells us,
"Your candy is in the back here. Open up the door and come on in."
I know when something is up, and my alarm bells were punching my brain at this point. We all give each other a confused look. Then we ask the man, "Why isn't the door already open? And why aren't you out here? Couldn't you have done the same thing with a take one note or something?" He just repeats himself, telling us to get into the back of his van for our candy. We say no and continue on with our trick-or-treating. About 20 minutes later, we're about 2 blocks away. We notice a van about halfway down the street behind us. The same black van from before. I tell the others and we agree to haul ass back to my friend's house. Once the van notices us running away, it takes off in the other direction. When we got to our friend's house, we frantically tell our parents about what happened. They called the cops, but as far as I know, they never found the van. We agreed not to trick-or-treat this year, and decided to just hang out instead. I still wonder what would have happened if we had been stupid enough to enter that van. Number 2. I used to own a small Halloween-themed shop that was located downtown in a fairly small city. And unlike many businesses in town after Walmart's arrival, my store never really suffered when it came to customers. Of course, it was only open for the month of October. I sold a lot of unique things you might find at other novelty stores in bigger cities, but for cheaper prices. I really didn't do it for profit as much as I did to celebrate the spooky Halloween spirit. I also love to celebrate that spirit by doing the best to scare the crap out of people every Halloween. On one particular Halloween, my chosen victim was my buddy Alex. He was a pretty relaxed and calm guy for most of the time, so he was the perfect person for the plan I had in mind. First, you should know that I always began packing up my store on Halloween fairly early in the morning, as it was unlikely to get customers on the holiday itself. I told Alex that I had much heavier merchandise that year and could use his help moving it all out. Not knowing what he was getting into, he accepted, and I told him to meet me at the shop around 10 p.m. sharp. As I said, Alex was a very relaxed and calm guy for most of the time. Well, unfortunately for him, he had once told me about his irrational fear of clowns and how he couldn't function around them. So naturally, my plan involved dressing up in a clown costume. When he would arrive at the shop, I would stand perfectly still like a statue. Once he realized he couldn't find me, he would then call me, most likely. But when my phone rang, it would be in the pocket of an apparent clown statue, and when he came over to investigate, I would give him my best scare. Pretty simple plan, right? Everything was set in motion. I dressed up and stood near the back of the store, obscured by some boxes and other decorations, and waited for his arrival. A little after 10, Alex entered. It was very dark, as I made the last-minute decision to cut out the lights before he arrived. He called my name a few times, but of course I didn't respond. I heard him walking around a bit, looking around the shop for me. I could barely hold back my laughter. But after more shuffling, I heard Alex speak in a defensive tone. "Not funny, dude." I looked around, but there was definitely no way he could see me right now, even if I had twitched or anything. I continued to play dumb. "Come on, man," he repeated again, sounding angrier this time. "That's not funny." Confused, I quietly adjusted a nearby stack of boxes so I could peer through the crack towards his voice. I couldn't make out his shape very well, but I knew for sure he was not looking in my direction. Suddenly my phone rang. I heard Alex turn towards the sound instantly. I froze, giddy with excitement that the plan might be working. But as he approached, I realized he wasn't holding his phone, and a wave of disappointment fell over me as I discovered my prank had been ruined by another caller. "Alright, fine, you got me," I announced shortly after the phone stopped ringing, taking off my mask and stepping out into the open. But Alex's face didn't look relieved. His face twisted in such horror in a way that I had never seen before. He began yelling and spouting panicked words, and I spent the next few minutes trying to get him to calm down. He explained to me that when he entered the store, a man in a clown costume was staring at him and then began slowly walking towards him. But when my phone rang, the man had dashed right out of the store. Alex had no idea that I was actually hiding in the back of the store the whole time. I don't want to think about what could have happened if Alex had showed up late that night, or if my other friend had never called during the prank. Number 3. I'm a police officer. A situation that stands out the most would have to be Halloween of 2001. This particular experience nearly made me take a leave due to the weirdness, so don't say I didn't warn you. It starts off on a regular Halloween patrol. My regular partner was sick, but somehow still managed to attend a party, so I was stuck with a crotchety racist bastard who I didn't like. After about an hour, he says something like, "Hey, Spook, what's going on over there?" After a brief and angry discourse on nomenclature, we stopped to see what looked like an impromptu costume orgy past a thicket on the side of the road. This was normal for Halloween, and was more often than not middle-aged partygoers. The two men were dressed like Mickey Mouse, and the woman was hard to see, but appeared to be dressed as a deer. Normally when I see the old random hump, I let them have the privacy to finish, and then chase them off or arrest them depending on location. This time was disconcerting though. They weren't holding the woman down, but from what I could see she was unresponsive, so we strolled up and tapped on the tree behind them. They didn't stop canoodling, but what we saw made us jump back, and I'm ashamed to admit I threw up on the spot. This is the part where I say I saw what was the single most awful thing and I'm assuming racist asshole as well, have ever seen. It wasn't a deer costume. It was a half-butchered doe, with its intestines strewn about. They were taking turns fucking it, and all they were wearing was Mickey Mouse masks. That was really hard to write because the image is still fresh in my brain, even after all these years. This was just so inhumanly awful that I can't describe it. I might tear up. I'm not kidding. Anyway, we stare completely frozen for about a minute until racist asshole takes out his gun and starts yelling at them. These guys don't pay any attention to us and just keep humping away, covered from the waist down in blood and what appeared to be some solid matter. Finally, my brain kicks in, and I tell racist asshole to lower his gun, and we both step forward and detain the two men. We call it all in, and we take the two men back to the station. They don't say a damn word the whole way back, but one of them kept chuckling. They tested positive for meth. Big fucking surprise. And they both were very incoherent, even after they came down. I didn't look too much into it, but they apparently were both run-of-the-mill laborers who had gone missing months prior. So that has to be one of the more gruesome things I've ever seen. One of the most visually disturbing anyway. So yeah, happy Halloween.
So, I was very young when this happened. So young, in fact, that I don't remember a whole lot, only bits and pieces. I'd say that I was 5 or 6 years old. My parents filled in the gaps for me, so I'm going to tell the whole version of the story, both my parts and theirs. We were living in an old farmhouse at the time. My parents were poor, so they rented from a landlord that owned a few small properties in the area. My dad worked in the steel mill on the midnight shift, so he worked some odd hours. This is relevant because it might be the only reason that we're still alive and that I'm able to write this story today.
Help! He's going to rape me! Help me!
We jolted out of bed and were fully awake in an instant. I was sleeping in my bed with my parents that night because I was having some awful night terrors. My dad, who had just switched from midnight shifts to days, jumped out of bed and cautiously made his way down the stairs, grabbing a stoking pick from the fireplace in the living room. He got to the door when he heard it again.
Help! Help! Oh my God, he's coming!
The woman's voice on the other side of the door began sobbing hysterically. "We have to help her. Open the door," said my mother. My mum is an inherently good woman who always goes out of her way to help people every single day of her life. She reached out for the deadbolt, but my dad stopped her. He shot her a look and said cautiously through the door, "What's going on? Who's after you and where is he?" The voice through the door responded,
I just need to get in before he gets here. Please. Please.
More sobs. My father turned on the porch light and said, "Stay up on the porch with your back against the door." He then opened the deadbolt, but not the chain lock. He slipped a brick that we used as a doorstop through the crack. "Take this and use it to defend yourself if you need it. I'll be right on the other side of this door, and if he comes after you, I'll come out and help. In the meantime, I'm calling the police. They'll be here soon." This is when the woman starts to absolutely lose her mind. She began slamming her whole body into the door with a mindless fury.
What the fuck's wrong with you? Let me in this goddamn house right now. What kind of fucking people are you?
My dad forced the door shut and clicked the deadbolt home again. He immediately called the police, and they came within 10 minutes. When they arrived, the woman was simply gone. The doorstop brick was sitting on one of the porch steps. My parents gave a description of the events and the woman as best they could. We tried our best to get some sleep in the following nights, but my mum and dad checked all of the locks and windows several times throughout the night. I don't remember understanding what happened, but I remember thinking that my parents were acting strange and wondering why they didn't help this woman. I thought the man snuck up and got her while we were calling the police. A few days later, we found out that the police had been called for a similar situation at a different house. My dad's brother-in-law worked in law enforcement and told us that that time the police happened to have a car down the street and arrived without lights and sirens. The officers saw the woman that my parents had described at the front door on top of the porch. When they began walking up to her, a man dashed out of the bushes from the side of the porch. They chased him down pretty quickly and recovered a long kitchen knife from the bushes where he had been hiding. The man and the woman had been working together to try to gain entry to houses. The police surmised that the woman would get people to open their doors and let her in, and then she would let her partner in. God only knows what they would have done once they got inside. Once I heard this story and put it together with my memories of the event, it sent chills down my spine. Imagine what would have happened if my dad had been working the midnight shifts, or if he had just been asleep. He grew up in a very bad neighborhood, Gary, Indiana, so he was always cautious about people around him. Usually, it was mildly irritating, but that time, it may have saved our lives. Number 2. This happened on a Norwegian peninsula when I was about 15 years old. It must have been 2006, give or take a year. Regardless, it was Halloween night, and I didn't really have any plans. Too old for trick-or-treating, too young for partying. It was a small peninsula anyway, so there wasn't much going on. I was just sat at home, playing RuneScape on my desktop. This continued until sundown. You could say I was mildly addicted to that game. I usually like to play with the lights off. Bad for your eyes, but I like the mood it set. Anyway, it's around 9 PM. My mum comes into my room and pats me on the shoulder. "Didn't you hear me? I said I'm going out for 20 minutes, she said. I had my noise-cancelling headphones on, so I was oblivious to the fact that she'd been shouting to me. She heads downstairs, and I hear the door slam. I put my headphones back on and sink back into my own little pixelated world. As such, I can't really tell you how much time passed when this happened. When you looked out of my bedroom door, which at the time was wide open, you could see down into the long corridor leading to my mum's room opposite. Since all of the lights were off, I could only really make out the outlines of all the objects, and that was only after my eyes adjusted after looking at the bright computer screen. Until then, it was like looking into a dark void of total blackness. You know when one of your senses has picked up on something that you're not totally conscious of yet, and you feel a little uneasy? Well, that happened to me while I was playing. It felt like someone else was around me, like that I'm being watched sensation. I figure my mum came back from wherever she went, and that I just hadn't heard her due to my headphones. But if that was the case, why hadn't she turned the lights on? I looked down into the dark corridor. At the far end, something's glowing. It's large and fluorescent green. It's spherical. Looks like a floating orb of some kind. I freak out and whip off my headphones. After looking at it for a moment, it becomes clear that this isn't an orb at all, or anything supernatural like that. There's 2 black holes where eyes should be, and a dark slit for a mouth. It's a glow-in-the-dark mask, and it's not floating. Someone's wearing it. Whoever it is facing me. I can't make out the rest of their body, but the head is definitely looking in my direction and is slowly inching closer. It's some sort of distorted, expressionless face. It's hard to describe, but the image of it is burned deep into my memory. Realizing he's been spotted, the guy freezes. We just stare at each other for what felt like the longest time. He raises a finger up to the lips of his mask. Shh, I'm just a trick-or-treater. It's a thick, manly voice, one I didn't recognize. In a state of shock, and not really knowing how to react, I just sit there, keeping my eyes on him. So, trick or treat? I mumble out, neither. Please go now. But he doesn't go. The glowing face starts moving towards me. Desperate to keep him out of my bedroom, I leap up and slam my door closed, locking it and pressing the full weight of my body against it. The guy is just outside my door. I can hear his deep breaths on the other side. He tries the door handle. It rattles. More heavy breaths. He tries the handle again. Then I can hear quick footsteps moving down the stairs, and what I think is my front door opening and closing. Still in shock, I just sit in my barricaded room, sobbing to myself until my mum finally returns. It felt like forever since I'd last seen her. She asked me what was wrong, why I was crying, and why there was a large Hessian sack left in the corridor. I told her what had just happened. She called the police for me immediately. I like to think that this was just a crazy person, and that they didn't really have any intention of harming me. Just some sort of messed up Halloween prank. Whatever the case, it was a surreal experience, and the image of that floating, talking face has haunted me for the longest time. The most unnerving part about this to me, though, is the fact that the peninsula really was very small. For me to see a face around town that I didn't recognize was very rare. More than likely, someone in my family knew who this person was. Hell, I probably knew who it was. I hate to think that after that event, I may very well have interacted with that person. The thought that they specifically targeted me out of everyone in the area made me extremely uncomfortable. I never felt safe there after that. That's part of the reason I moved away when I was 18. It was late October in Sofia, Bulgaria. That year, Halloween fell on a Saturday, and my friend Minchko was throwing a massive shindig at his parents' apartment. Now, this guy was rich by Bulgarian standards, born into money. So when I say apartment, don't think of a typical, grotty Sofian flat. Think more along the lines of one of those unrealistically huge apartments from an American sitcom. His parents had gone away for the weekend to either Spain or Italy or somewhere else suitably warm, and as such, things were set to go wild. When the night finally rolled around, I dressed up in my zombie costume and set out to meet some friends. Minchko's invitation said that the party started at 8, so naturally, me and my group of chums didn't plan to arrive until 10. Gotta be fashionable. When we did arrive, most of the guests were already pretty drunk. The vodka was flowing freely, put it like that. They had a massive punch bowl, which was probably only 10% juice knowing Minchko. Some of us had a few midterm exams coming up, so we didn't want to go too wild. We just had a few beers, while everyone else pigged out on punch. Other than the people on my course, there was one other guy who wasn't really drinking that night. Some dude in a wolfman mask who was just hanging around the punch bowl. He didn't seem to know anybody at the party and was keeping to himself. Looked a little awkward, to be honest. The friendly half of me wanted to introduce myself, invite him to hang out with me and my friends. My socially anxious other half, however, decided against that. The night goes on, and one of the partiers starts to complain about having stomach pain. I figure he's overdone it. Some guys really can't handle their alcohol. He makes his way to the bathroom and starts vomiting. Not long afterwards, another guest starts complaining about the same problem, and then another. and another. Eventually, a dozen or so people are grabbing their stomachs in pain. Things start to seem serious, with some people even vomiting on the living room floor. A little worried, someone calls for medical assistance. At the hospital, things turned out not to be an extreme instance of alcohol poisoning. Instead, we found out that the punch bowl contained a secret ingredient that someone had slipped in. It had been laced with rat poison. Thankfully, the dosage wasn't high enough to kill anyone immediately, but without treatment, the amount could have been fatal within a few hours. At a party full of drunk people, it was totally possible that no one would have been sober enough to react appropriately and call an ambulance. Somebody also could have easily passed out, not realizing that they'd been poisoned. Thankfully, though many were hospitalized, nobody ended up with any prolonged health issues. When we were questioned about what we all knew, the guy in the wolf mask came into my mind. He had been hanging around the punch bowl. I mentioned it to the police, and said that one of the other guests must have known who he was. Talking to my friends about it afterwards, though, it seemed like nobody did know who he was. Everybody assumed that he was a friend of somebody else's, and didn't bother to question his attendance. As far as anybody could remember, nobody talked to him, nobody saw him without his mask on, and nobody even remembered who he turned up with, or even when he arrived at all. He had just slipped in unnoticed. To begin with, the police investigation turned up very little. It seemed as though it was just a one-off incident, some guy wanting to cause harm to a lot of people at once. But people like that rarely try this sort of thing only once. Almost 1 year later to the day, on the next Halloween weekend, the exact same thing happened at a party in a different part of town. This time, the amount of poison used was increased. 3 people almost lost their lives that night, and 10 were hospitalized. This time, however, the perpetrator was tackled by another partygoer who realized what he was up to. Under questioning, the police realized that the guy in the wolf mask was obviously a little disturbed in the head. He cited an event known as the Jonestown Massacre as his inspiration behind his actions. Looking into it, it turns out it was an event in the late 70s where over 300 members of a cult died after being forced to drink from a poisoned punch bowl. This unstable nutjob wanted to pay homage to the largest mass suicide in history. For the first time in my life, I was damn thankful that I had exams coming up. I'm known for going a little bit wild at parties, and for trying to drink everyone under the table. Who's to say I wouldn't have chugged more poison punch than my body could have handled? Whenever Minchko hosts a Halloween party now, he always checks under everyone's mask at the door, just to make sure they're on the guest list.
20 years ago, when I was 5 going on 6, I dressed up as Pennywise the Clown for Halloween. I wore the costume all day due to my school letting us wear them for parties in our classes. When we were dismissed from school, my father met me with a pleasant surprise. He was dressed in a yellow raincoat and had a hat on, and he was Georgie from the movie It. He held my hand as we went to the car, then we drove home. A few hours go by, and my father took me out to go trick-or-treating because my mother wasn't feeling too well. The night went on as scheduled, kids bombarding doors for candy, teenagers scaring each other, and parents losing their kids. Everyone loved our costumes. Again, I was Pennywise the Clown and he was Georgie from the 1990 It. My father held my hand in between each house and waited at the end of each driveway. One house took longer than others, and I remembered that I was very anxious. Once I received my candy, I remembered that there were more people than usual, and I had to run through a crowd to get to my father. I reached him, held his hand, and off we went, but it was the opposite direction of where we initially were going. I didn't think anything of it because of how young I was. We went down one of the dark back streets where our garbage was picked up for some reason, and we were walking unusually fast. I remember that I said, "Daddy," but my father started moving faster and didn't answer me. Then all of a sudden, I heard my name yelled out from about 25 yards behind us. and it was my father's voice. I looked back and it was my father. I looked up at the person that I was walking with, and he had on the same costume as my dad, but when I looked closer, I noticed it wasn't him. I looked at my dad and yelled out to him. The man then let me go, and as soon as he saw my father, he started running, and my father was running full speed at us. The man took off down the alley, then through a backyard. My father reached me and he was out of breath while he was hugging and kissing me, also asking me if I was okay. My father called the cops and explained to them that he lost track of me in a huge crowd at one of the houses and that there was some sick guy roaming our neighborhood. Once we got home, he told my mother everything that happened. He told her that a crowd gathered and some random guy with some costume the same as him walked up to him while I approached the porch. He told her that the guy said I was a cute kid. They wanted to just snatch me up in a joking manner. Then the crowd gathered even more, and he lost track of me until he saw us turn the corner onto the back street, and that's when he started to run after us and yell my name. Now looking back, I bet my father was losing his mind and probably wanted to kill that guy when he saw us together. Until this day, I'm grateful that my father found us when he did, because who knows what would have happened to me. When I was a kid, I loved Halloween. I went trick-or-treating up until I was 12. My last time going trick-or-treating, I went with my friend Drew. He loved Halloween as much as I did. This Halloween, everyone seemed more wild than usual, but it was Halloween and that's how teenagers act, I guess. We went to a house that had a flashlight lit on the front porch, but no candy. We noticed that everyone stopped at the end of the walkway. They kept walking past the house once they noticed that there wasn't any candy. Not us. I told Drew we should check it out. Or we should just let these people know to turn their light off because it's confusing people. Approaching the house, we noticed that none of the lights were on in the house. As Drew was set to knock on the door, one of the front windows raised just a little bit, and the blinds moved back about an inch. Drew put his hand down, and the both of us looked at the window. Then the voice said,
"Hey, just come in for the candy."
The door opened a bit, and by surprise, Drew walked in like a dummy. I asked him why he was going in, and he said, "I want some As he turned to answer me, someone put their hands on his mouth. I immediately ran forward to help him, then I heard multiple voices yelling, "Grab him." The door shut. I could hear wrestling sounds. Drew was fighting these guys. I started yelling, screaming, and banging on the door, but I couldn't get in. I didn't have a cell phone, so I ran down the street asking people to help, and that my friend was in trouble. Everyone laughed and were telling me that they're not falling for it. I got a block away and I ran into a police officer. I told him what was going on, but he was very skeptical due to it being Halloween. He put me in his car, and I showed him where the house was. As we were pulling up to the house, I saw my friend's body on the front lawn with people just walking past. I started yelling and screaming to the cop that it was my friend and he needs the help. The police officer believed me once we got up to my friend. He was bloody. Luckily, he was alive, but those guys beat him pretty badly. Then they dropped his body and left. The police officer told us that the house was abandoned, and that's why we didn't notice any lights on. My friend is pretty much scarred for life, especially being that people were walking past him as if he were a Halloween ornament and laughing. But luckily, that cop listened to me. And honestly, I haven't celebrated Halloween since. This all happened 28 years ago, when I was 8 years old. My mother and my father would often take me to visit my grandparents for Halloween. My aunt lived 2 houses down from my grandparents, and I could go trick-or-treating with my cousins. Between my grandparents' place and my aunt's place, there was an old dilapidated house. We always skipped it when we went trick-or-treating Halloween night because the woman who lived there gave us the creeps. She was very big, like a huge woman. She was over 6 feet tall and wore chains around her neck and heavy work boots. There was obviously something very wrong with her. Whenever we went back and forth between my aunt's place and my grandparents' place, we always had to run past the woman's house because she was always standing at her windows watching us. It was so creepy that we never dared to run past her house alone. Sometimes the big woman would be outside of her house watering the garden or scrubbing the windows. When we ran past, she would shout and yell at us. She would tell us that the devil was coming for us. We told the adults about her, but they just told us to leave her alone and stay away from her. One Halloween, we were going trick-or-treating with my other older cousins. They dared us to go to the big woman's house and knock on her door. I remember being so afraid, but I didn't want to look like a coward, so I agreed. Dressed in our Halloween costumes, we walked up to her driveway and rang the doorbell. Suddenly, there was a lot of banging and slamming noises coming from the house. We were frightened, and I was about to run away when the door creaked open. The woman was standing there in the dim light. She was holding something in her hands, but when we saw what it was, we all ran screaming down the driveway. It looked like a human head. When we got home, we were all shaking and out of breath. Some of the younger kids were crying. The adults asked us what was wrong, and when we told them what we had seen, they just laughed at us, and they didn't take it serious. My grandfather said it was just a Halloween prop, and my grandmother told us we shouldn't be bothering that woman. After we all calmed down, we went outside again and continued trick-or-treating. However, we stayed away from that big woman's house. About a month later, my father got a phone call from my grandparents. They said that the big woman who lived next door had attacked my aunt. My aunt had just came home from shopping. She was carrying her groceries in one arm, and she had my baby cousin in her other arm. Just as she got to her front door, the big woman appeared out of nowhere. She had a rope saw and put it around my aunt's neck. My aunt flipped out and immediately dropped the groceries along with my baby cousin. My aunt managed to get her hands around the rope saw. She started kicking her front door with her feet as she struggled. Her husband heard all of the commotion, and when he saw what was happening, he ran outside and got the woman off of my aunt. My aunt survived the attack, but it left her with scars on her hands, along with scars across the front of her neck. Of course, the police were called, and they arrested the big woman. When they searched her house, they found something that shocked everybody in the area. The woman had been digging tunnels under her home, which came up under my aunt's house, my grandparents' house, and another neighbor's house. She had been bringing the dirt up and putting it in her flower beds in her garden. But that wasn't all. The most chilling discovery was that she had also built some kind of shrine under her house with candles and other stuff on it. At the center of the shrine was a real human head. Needless to say, it was the same head that we saw when we went trick-or-treating on Halloween night. She had already murdered one woman, and my aunt almost became the next severed head in her collection.
The night before Halloween of 2006, I was walking down the sidewalk to my friend's house. As I was making my way down the sidewalk, I saw something moving across the street a little ways in front of me. I wasn't too familiar with the Halloween movies at the time, but I did recognize the Michael Myers mask as I watched the figure walk into the front yard of a house that was on the other side of the street. It then stopped, looked in my direction, and then turned and kept walking across the front yard. I was more weirded out than afraid. I figured this guy had to have been someone who lived there and was playing a practical joke on someone. I continued to my friend's house and eventually forgot all about it. The next morning, I was waiting for the school bus to come to pick up me and my sister. It was still pretty early, and the morning fog was rising up from the grass, and the frost was slowly melting off the windshields of some nearby parked cars. I was just wandering up and down the sidewalk when I saw the Michael Myers guy again. This time he was directly across the road, standing between two garages and looking my way. I pointed him out to my sister, but he was standing so still that she assumed that he was some kind of Halloween decoration. I was tempted to call out to him, but I decided against it. And even in my 12-year-old mind, I felt genuine alarm that an adult could walk around with a mask on this early and stare at someone else's children. It wasn't until I was on the bus that the figure finally moved. I tried to point him out to my sister, but the bus was already moving, and he was out of sight. That night was Halloween, and my sister and I went out dressed as Ash and Misty, and my father accompanied us, occasionally saying, "Pikachu," in a really loud, squeaky voice when other people were close by to embarrass us. It wasn't until we were on our way home that I saw the Michael Myers guy again. He was walking down the side of the road behind us. Other people were walking by him without even reacting. I tried to point him out to my father, but he barely looked twice at the figure. When we got home, I watched from my bedroom as the figure stood outside our front lawn. He waited there for a few minutes before disappearing around the side of our house. Now I was starting to get nervous. I asked my dad if one of his friends was messing with us, and I begged him to take a look outside. But he came back a minute later with a completely carefree attitude, stating that there was no one there. Later that night, my sister crept into my room and whispered that there was someone outside of her bedroom window. Instead of calling out to my parents, who were both asleep, I grabbed my flashlight and followed her back to her room. I told her not to turn on any lights. When we got to the window, I turned on the flashlight and shone the beam directly into the face of Michael Myers, who was standing directly outside peering through the window. His hands were cupped against his eyes to help him see inside. When the light hit him, you would think that he would have bolted, but instead he remained motionless. He opened his hands and slapped the window hard enough to knock a framed picture off the wall. I screamed like I was being eaten by a shark. The figure then put his right index finger up to the lips of his mask, as if telling me to shush. He then vanished into the darkness. My father then burst into the room, and we both started crying as we told him what we saw. The cops were called, but they took their time getting there, obviously not very concerned that it was anything other than a Halloween prank. Had I not seen the stranger before that night, I may have believed that. The neighborhood was searched, but no one wearing a Michael Myers mask was found. A few weeks later, I had come down with a cold and was staying home from school. My sister waited alone at the bus stop that day. While she was there, someone tried to pull up next to her in a white van and tried to convince her to climb in. She sprinted back to the house and told my mom. I'm not sure if this connects to the man in the Michael Myers mask, but something tells me that it does.
I think for any American teenager, starting high school has to be one of the most stressful, daunting experiences of their entire education. But for me, it was particularly rough. You see, I was a real late bloomer, still very much a squeaker by the time I got to be a freshman. While the boys my age were getting growth spurts and sprouting facial hair, I could easily have still passed for like 11 or 12. I mean, I got caught up eventually, don't get me wrong, but there are pictures of me from back then that my current roommate has seen, and he jokes that I had the body of an anorexic bikini model. I'd like to argue to the contrary, but honestly, that's not far off. So unfortunately, I was an obvious target for bullying seniors, the worst of which was this big slab of meat with red hair named Josh. Josh used to push me into lockers on a daily basis like, "Are you sure you're old enough to be here, short stuff?" And I was in absolutely no position to be able to defend myself. So this goes on for like a month, and each time I get sicker and sicker of how he's treating me. It's not like I was a total pushover either. Despite my small stature, I'd managed to deter any potential middle school bullies by being something of a pint-sized brawler. Even if you don't quite win a fight, you can still inflict a fair amount of damage, and after that, suddenly they don't want the smoke anymore. So it was honestly only a matter of time before I snapped at Josh. Sure, he was bigger than me, but I was about perfectly positioned to nail one good punch to the balls, and after that, there was little chance he'd want to lay hands on me again. Anyway, it's getting closer and closer to Halloween, and some of the bullying is getting pretty intense, and I said, each time something happens, I get more and more furious. Up until the point where, on the morning of Halloween, me and my friends are talking about going trick-or-treating that evening, swapping costume ideas and stuff, when Josh appears like out of nowhere and starts verbally pounding on us about how we're such a bunch of nerds. I think it was how he was trying to show me up in front of my friends that really did it. I just couldn't stand the thought of losing face in front of them, so I clapped back with like, "Yeah, but your mom loves it when I dress up for her." Josh just stops dead, like this blank expression on his face. My buddies are all laughing like, "Got him," and I'm half expecting Josh to start trying to pummel on me, but he doesn't move. He just stares off into the near distance for like a full minute while I look back at him in confusion. Then, without a word in reply, Josh just storms off without so much as looking at us, but before he disappears around a corner, he full-on throws a right hook into a locker so hard he put a dent in the thing. Just like boom, punches it so loud a teacher comes out from a class, screaming and asking what was that. It felt kinda good knowing I'd gotten him so mad, even if I probably would end up suffering for it. But just how much I'd suffer for it, I had absolutely no idea. So cut to like an hour or two later and we're all having lunch, sitting around the tables just minding our own business. One by one, seniors start coming up to our table like, "Did you really say that stuff to Josh about his mom?" And when I say yes, they're all like, "Wow, dude. Just, wow." Walking away, shaking their heads and laughing. This happens like a bunch of times too, and at first I think they're just impressed that I flamed the bully so hard, but there's something else there too. Something that kinda piqued my curiosity. So, in the end, when this one senior kid asked what I'd said, I stopped and was like, "Why is that such a big deal? Guy had it coming." "Yeah, but you brought up his mom," the kid replied, like it wasn't what kids always bring up against each other when they're trading insults. I'm like, "So what? Yo mama jokes are like old news by now." The kid then looks at me like I just told him I thought the earth was flat. "Dude, Josh's mom died over summer break. Sudden cancer diagnosis or something. It was brutal." It's hard to even sum up the mix of emotions I felt in that moment. Like I felt like a douche. Bully or no bully, losing your mom like that must be one of the worst things that can ever happen to a person, and to remind him of it made me feel terrible. Then, having not known, that just made me feel so out of the loop, just like an outsider or something, like I had no place being there, which was already bad enough considering my physique. But what really overwhelmed me was the fear I felt, knowing I'd made him so unbelievably furious. The locker punch suddenly made all the sense in the world, and I imagined the kind of revenge I'd personally want if someone made fun of my dead mom like that. Suddenly a few crotch punches didn't seem like such an effective deterrent. Josh would be wanting to tear me apart. I managed to duck him for the rest of the day. For a while I was actually debating whether or not I should actually just bite the bullet and apologize to him. A little empathy might have been good for all involved, and it's not like I would be doing so just to save my own skin, like I genuinely felt bad about having said what I said. But I guess I was just too cowardly to actually seek him out, and doing so seemed like a dumb move on my part when it would just be easier to ninja around school and bail when the final bell rang, which is exactly what I did. Then just headed home in the hopes that a little trick-or-treating fun would be exactly what I needed to take my mind off the whole thing. Besides, it was a Friday, and whatever was going to happen over the mom insult fiasco was at least going to have to wait until Monday. I'd gotten myself what was essentially a stay of execution. So like I said, that night was Halloween, and me and a few buddies had planned on going trick-or-treating together. It was a good time. I mean, anything involving free candy always makes for a good time, right? And the night was going smoothly, right up until we stop at a crosswalk where this car is pulling up. The car stops, and we step out into the street as we start to walk in front of it. Then, right as we're on a level heading with it, One of my buddies is like, "Don't look, dude," under his breath, nudging me and pointing towards the car. And naturally I look. Big mistake. Because who sat in the driver's seat of that car cruising around on Halloween night with his buddies? Of all the people on the face of Earth that I really didn't want to run into that evening, it had to be them sitting in their car at the crosswalk. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. It was the slab of meat, Josh. And right then, as I'm perfectly positioned in front of his car, we lock eyes with one another. Obviously, I'm wearing a costume, but no mask, so although it takes him a minute of being like, "Why does this little runt seem familiar to me?" he does actually recognize who I am. Now, I knew he was going to be mad, but I didn't expect him to be this mad, because as soon as it hits him that it's me walking in front of the car, he guns his engine and just lurches forward, actually trying to straight up run me and my friends over. We managed to run out of the way just in time, and he heads up the street while onlookers are like, "Oh God, did you see that? Those poor kids almost got hit," and stuff, while we watch from the sidewalk as he does a very illegal U-turn before coming right back at us. We just start running down the sidewalk, trying our very best to escape, but the dude was in his car, so we stood absolutely no chance of getting away from him. Josh just guns it past us, cutting off our route of escape, then jumps out of the car to give chase. He was a big dude, but Jesus Christ was he fast. So needless to say, he catches up to me in like no time at all and just tackles me down onto the sidewalk. Then, as you can probably guess, Josh then proceeds to beat the goo out of me, with me shouting, I'm sorry, I didn't know," the whole time. Like he's just raining blows down on me, kicking me while I'm balled up on the sidewalk, when I hear something I still feel kind of conflicted about. He's grunting and cursing at me for a while, but then I hear something else. He's like whimpering or something as he's hitting me. Then his voice starts to break while he's calling me all kinds of names, and I come to realize that he's actually crying. It was weird. I could have at least tried to get up and make a run for it, but I didn't. I just shut up and let him wail on me for a while because honestly, I felt like I kind of deserved it. I know that probably sounds really dumb. He was a bully, and he's probably still a bully now, but yeah, there it is. I just felt really sorry for the guy. No one deserves to lose their mom like that. No one. He only stops beating on me when he's actually full-on ugly crying, then he heads back to his car and just drives off into the night. My trick-or-treating partners had long since ran off, leaving me alone and bloodied on the sidewalk, trying and failing a few times to find my feet. I mean, I didn't blame them. Hearing that car engine revving behind us was one of the scariest experiences of our lives, but yeah, I was all alone at that point. So like I said, it took me a while to be able to stand up enough to start my walk home. But not until I gathered up some of the candy that had spilled out of my sack during the beatdown, which was going to be badly needed for some soul-soothing that night. I snuck in, dodged my parents, then told them the next morning that my bruises were just down to us play fighting and trying the kind of stuff that you don't try at home was all about. Mom was mad, but it meant I didn't have to tell them something that I was deeply ashamed of. Yeah, maybe it was like an unprovoked thing. Just Josh being the monster that he was. I'd have to tell them the truth, but given the circumstances, it had probably come out that I had insulted this kid's dead mom, in which case I wouldn't have a leg to stand on. But there it is. It was the scariest thing to happen to me for that Halloween and really any Halloween to come after. And the bullying didn't stop, but then again, when does it ever?
My name is Bree. This happened in 2016. I was 19 years old at the time. I was up late the night before into the early morning studying, and I hadn't had much sleep, so I had just woken up from a nap. I decided to hop in the shower to wake myself. That's when I heard this weird scraping sound coming from somewhere outside. I stopped the shower and peered out from behind the curtain, and then made my way over to the window. I saw nothing, but I could still hear the noise. I thought it may have been my neighbor working in a shed, so I ignored the disturbance and finished up in the shower. Before I continue, I should inform you that I have severe anxiety problems, and I often get a little paranoid sometimes. It also doesn't help that I have PTSD as well. Anyways, I was now back in my room, and I took a seat on my bed. I texted my then boyfriend and asked him what he wanted for dinner. While I was waiting for him to respond, I just relaxed and scrolled through my Facebook. I was reading an article about the recent clown sightings that were happening at the time, when I was interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming from outside. I stopped and listened carefully. I heard a few more steps, followed by a tapping noise. I was a bit confused by this. It hadn't yet occurred to me that I had an unwelcomed guest outside. I was thinking why my boyfriend hadn't knocked on the door or called before he showed up. We usually had a routine with things like this, especially if I was home alone. He would either text, call, or FaceTime me to let me know when he was on his way home, or if he was at the door, because there had been a lot of shady activity around our neighborhood at the time. I then called out to him, and suddenly, all fell silent. I texted him and asked if he was at the door. There was no reply, so I decided to peek through the bedroom window. While I was making my way to the other side of the room, my phone started ringing. It was my boyfriend wanting to FaceTime. When I answered, he said he was about 15 minutes away. As I was talking to him, I pulled back the curtains of my bedroom window, and that's when all the blood in my veins turned to ice as I came face to face with a fucking clown. I know I wasn't hallucinating. An actual clown was looking at me through the window, smiling. After my initial shock, I actually started to laugh, thinking that this had to be some kind of prank my boyfriend was pulling on me. So I played along, pretending to be terrified, and whispered into the phone, "Very funny, asshole. Love the whole scary clown thing." I chuckled and rolled my eyes. My boyfriend was confused, and I explained to him about the clown at the window, and said that he and his friend did a good job scaring the piss out of me. He seemed confused, saying that all of his friends were hanging out at the pub, and that he was not a part of any plan to prank me. Upon hearing this, I felt my stomach in my throat as I looked back at the clown, who was still just outside my window. He reached into his costume and pulled out a very real-looking butcher's knife. By this point, I wasn't sure what was going on, so I grabbed my baseball bat. My boyfriend told me that he was now only a few minutes away. He shouted at me to stay inside and to lock all the doors and windows. I quickly closed the curtains and went into the lounge. It wasn't long before I heard a loud pounding on the front door. Suddenly, I heard a creepy voice coming from the other side.
"Let me in, child."
I didn't respond to the voice. I just stood perfectly still, waiting for the next move. Loud pounding rang out again, causing the door to rattle on its hinges, but I kept quiet, even when I heard the doorknob rattling. Although I was pretty scared at this point, I was also getting a tad irritated, and yelled out to the clown, "Fuck off! Go annoy someone else!" I then heard muffled laughter, followed by the creepy voice.
"Please let me in, doll. I just want to play. I want to play with your insides."
I had enough of this. I was about to go out and confront this creepy asshole myself when I heard my boyfriend's voice, who was still on the phone, say, "Hang up and call the cops." After some consideration, I thought that maybe confronting the creepy clown outside with a butcher's knife was not the correct course of action. So I did as my boyfriend said. I left the lounge and was soon explaining to the police dispatcher the situation. I was on my way back to my room when I heard the sound of glass breaking. I stopped in my tracks and told them that I think the clown just broke into the house. They immediately told me to get somewhere safe, and that's when I heard my ex yelling out, "Hey, what the fuck are you doing? Get the hell out of here! The police are on the way. The clown just bellowed out a psychotic laugh and took off. As I made my way back into the bedroom, something caught my eye. I peered out the window. Through a gap in the curtains, I saw another clown. He appeared to be holding some kind of saw blade in his hand. I went to move, but I was like a deer caught in the headlights. I couldn't move or scream. Fear then overcame me, as I realized my boyfriend was now out there with 2 creepy clowns. I screamed into the phone. "There's another clown outside my bedroom. Please hurry." After a few moments, I was relieved when I heard my boyfriend at the back door. I quickly let him inside. We then held each other tightly until the police arrived. After taking our statements, the police discovered a rusted hacksaw and an axe lying on the ground outside of my bedroom window. There were red marks all over them. Of course, the creepy clowns that had turned my night into a freak show were nowhere to be found. After that night, I struggled to fall asleep. I often think to myself, what would have happened to me if I had been stupid enough to open that door? Were they just a couple of thrill seekers looking to frighten a girl who was all alone? Or were they, in fact, out for blood?
My grandparents had passed away within a few months of each other, leaving their house empty. There was talk of renting it out initially, but because of its poor state of disrepair, the family decided against it. No consensus about what to do with it could be arrived at, therefore it would be left to decay for another decade or more before I would stumble upon it. My aunt and I were going through my mother's things and discovered an old family photo album. Mom had gone off on one of her journeys and no one was sure if she'd ever return. Her and I had been having an on and off relationship for years, so there was a lot about the family I didn't know. I came across a picture of her and I when I was just a baby, but I didn't recognize the house we were standing in front of. I inquired and my aunt told me about the old Wheeler family house that had once belonged to her parents. No one had been there in over a decade, and she wasn't even sure if it was still standing. So, after half an hour of badgering, she agreed to take me out to see it. That following morning, we headed out of town through 30 miles of cornfields until we came to a turnoff that led down a long, weedy gravel road. As we crested the hill, I was taken aback. The house I saw before me, despite being run down, was still breathtaking. In its prime, it must have been the finest home in the county. My aunt pulled up within a few yards of it and we got out. From what I could see, nobody but the occasional mowing company had been there in a very long time. I couldn't help but be in awe of the place. The vibrant pink and blue paint had long faded from its soaring towers and the massive porch was beginning to sag in a few places. Before I entered, I wanted to take in every bit of the wonderful facade as I could. Around the back was the remnants of the old horseshoe pit and, what I was told, my grandfather's Ford pickup. Although the big house had long seen its best days, I knew I hadn't seen anything that could have compared. Maybe one of those beautiful Victorian mansions in San Francisco. Even those would be dwarfed in comparison to this. When I was ready, we climbed the concrete steps and entered through the back entrance. From the moment we cracked the door, we were overwhelmed by a hideous smell coming from inside. We assumed it was a normal part of having a house sealed for so long and continued with our search. Everything appeared as if it had been left where it was on my grandmother's last day, almost like a time capsule or museum. The lights were even still working. Only later did I discover that my mother had been paying the bills all these years in hopes someone would return and live there someday. Walking from room to room and seeing all the beautiful antique furnishings, I couldn't stop wondering why I had never been told about the house. Regardless of our frequent estrangements, I would have helped my mother with the upkeep of it. It was downright insane to me to leave such a beautiful place to rot. Then again, my mother's strange ways were the main reason for our frequent falling outs. As we made our way to the second floor, the smell only got worse. I suggested we cut our visit short and just take a quick look around. Every door was closed, so I went for the closest one and stuck my head in. This must have been a guest room or spare. Upon the bed laid a beautiful and elaborate quilt easily over 100 years old. My aunt was going through a cedar chest in a room next to me. I joined her and we discovered another much older photo album and decided to bring back with us to look at later. She closed the door behind us and I made my way toward the last room. Unfortunately, the closer I got to the door, the stronger the smell got. I was reluctant to open it, but I thought if the poor critter was where I could get to it, I'd take it outside and give it a good burial. Cracking the door, the stench slapped me in the face, and I lost focus for a moment. When I regained my composure, I was met with a terrible sight. Before me was not a dead forest creature, but a human being. The bloated body, now unrecognizable, laid curled up silently on the bed. I could feel my knees begin to buckle, so I turned as quickly as possible away and out of the room. My aunt was confused by my behavior and stuck her head in before yanking it out, quickly again. We both ran down the stairs where the smell was less potent, and I called 911. The officers spent a few minutes in the room before coming back out with a small piece of paper and a driver's license. One of them joined us at the table where we were sitting and asked a few questions about my mother. This made me nervous, and I began demanding he explain himself. A serious look came across his face, and he told us that the body appeared to belong to my mom. I didn't want to believe it at first, but when he handed me her license, I knew it was true. My aunt and I held each other for a long time and cried. The officer gave us a few moments before interjecting himself again. Then he asked me if I knew why she would take her own life. I had naturally assumed my mom had died in her sleep. She was an older woman, but the note he handed me made everything clear. She had been depressed for a long time because of being at odds with each other, and the last time we spoke, some things were said and she feared she couldn't take it back. The morning after our argument, she decided to return to the only place that she'd ever been happy. Although she claimed to not be sure of what she was going to do at the time, the poor state of the house just sent her over the edge. The last sentence asked that I not blame myself for her death and that I move on with my life. The ending read simply, "Goodbye, Mom." A couple of weeks later, after everyone had time to deal with their grief, I brought the remaining family members together. After seeing the old house and realizing how the poor condition of it hurt my mother, I proposed we try to raise the money to renovate it. In light of what had just occurred, I wanted to at least try to create something positive from our tragedy. I was given their blessings and went to work. It took some time, but on the first day of spring 2018, the Historical Society allowed me to lead the first tour of the newly restored Wheeler Mansion. A great day could have been much better had my mother been there with me. No matter our differences, it was her who inspired me and the one who truly made it all possible.
I was born, raised, and still live in Texas. I come from a family of hunters. It's pretty much a family tradition. I'm going to tell you about something that I experienced when I was 20 years old, back in 2005. My father had just been diagnosed with lung cancer, and everyone in my family was naturally devastated by this, especially me, since my dad and I were very close. I had a lot of other personal stuff going on in my life at the time, and I felt that I needed to go out for a few days just to clear my head. I decided to make it a solo hunting trip, and packed up some camping gear, along with my Marlin 336 that my dad gifted to me when I was 18. If I could get sentimental for a moment, my father ended up passing away 3 years after his diagnosis, and to this day, I still use that rifle for hunting. Anyways, I'd say this happened around late October, early November. I don't want to be too specific with a location, because technically, I wasn't supposed to be hunting in this specific area. However, I will disclose that it was near the Mexican border. This will be important later. I decided to set up camp for 3 days before heading back. I had been hunting on this land before with some friends of mine, and I knew the precautions to take not to be spotted by the game warden. I'm sure if there's any other hunters listening to this broadcast, they'll be more than happy to tell you that we often wipe our asses with the rulebook. Before anyone judges me too harshly, or the practice of hunting in general, I will say that I'm a very spiritual person, and I have a profound respect for Mother Nature. I don't leave trash everywhere, and every animal that I put down, I never let go to waste. I'll be the first to admit, there are hunters that give us a bad name, and me not following the rules is more of a middle finger to the government than it is to the sport of hunting. I once straight up beat the shit out of someone who was a friend of a friend for shooting a stray dog for absolutely no reason. If it's consolation to anyone, I handed him a horrible ass whooping for that. But I digress. The first day went off without a hitch, no problems whatsoever, aside from the fact that there was no game to be found anywhere. So I figured that I would head further south the next day to see if my luck would improve. Other hunters knew about this restricted location and may have already cleaned out this area. As night fell, I found myself sprawled out next to my truck, just staring up at the night sky, wondering if me and my dad would ever take another hunting trip together. That's when I heard the sound of footsteps slowly making their way through a nearby brush. This was alarming for obvious reasons. Whoever they were, they had the drop on me. I knew better than to light up a campfire under these circumstances, but if this person was roaming around in the dark without a flashlight, they may have had some kind of night vision apparatus, giving them the advantage. I was concerned, because if you were looking at me through the trees at that particular moment, it would have appeared that I was sleeping. I was in this odd position where I was resting on top of my sleeping bag with a blanket, because I felt claustrophobic being fully immersed in a sleeping bag. It was a good thing too, because this meant I was able to mobilize quickly, and something told me that I only had seconds to make a decision. I rolled sideways, and as soon as I did, I caught a quick glimpse of a muzzle flash coming from the tree line directly in front of me. I felt dirt fly up and hit my back from the bullet striking the ground next to me. I scrambled to my feet as more shots rang out from the trees, one of them shattering the passenger side window of my truck. I took cover behind the bed of my pickup and quickly drew the .38 snub-nose that I had strapped to my ankle. After the gunfire died down, I laid flat on the ground and returned to fire in the direction of the trees from under the truck. I heard several sets of footsteps fleeing from the area, but I held my position in case my theory about the night vision was correct. With only 2 rounds left in my .38, I pretty much spent the rest of that night underneath my truck with my pistol aimed at the darkness until the sun came out and illuminated my surroundings. I very cautiously got out from beneath my vehicle and packed up my gear as quickly as I could and hightailed it out of there. Later on, when I told a friend of mine about the incident, he said he wished I would have told him that I was heading that way. He would have warned me that the Mexican cartel started using that area to smuggle contraband and people across the nearby border. This friend of mine was a Mexican immigrant himself and had several family members mixed up in the cartel and coyote groups, so needless to say, I trusted his word. All things considered, I think I got off pretty easy. Had I been in my sleeping bag that night, I have no doubt that bullet would have nailed me. These days, I stick to the designated hunting grounds. Some things are just not worth the risk.
I live in a major city in Texas. My apartment complex is gated and in a good neighborhood, but the security isn't extremely tight. Sometimes the gates are left open and anyone could piggyback off of someone else entering with the access code. Maybe twice in the past 3 years, the management has put out notices of vehicle break-ins and other items being stolen from porches. We also have frequent door-to-door solicitors, even though there are signs forbidding it. So this particular Friday evening, I go to bed at about 2:30 a.m. For some odd reason, I was having trouble getting to sleep, so I put on a podcast to listen to and eventually start to doze off. I become aware of a noise that sounds like a clicking sound, but it sounds like one of my upstairs neighbors making some noise. I kinda zoned this out, as I'm used to my neighbors staying up late on weekends. After about 30 seconds, I realized the noise is extremely repetitive and getting louder. I then start focusing on it more intently, trying to isolate what it could be and where it was coming from. Suddenly it hits me. It's coming from the entrance to my apartment. I leap out of bed and head to the foyer. I identify the noise right away. The lock mechanism is moving back and forth rapidly, like someone is trying to unlock the front door. I can hear that an object is inserted into the lock and the person is jimmying it back and forth with a lot of force. I instinctively turn around, head to my bedside safe, unlock it with a combination, and pull out my .357 SIG pistol, load a 14-round magazine, and chamber a hollow point round. I head back to the door, and as I exit the bedroom, I see the lock twist and unlatch. I immediately pointed my weapon straight ahead, knowing that if someone comes through, I will have to make a split-second reaction. I decide that if someone comes through my door, I will give them a momentary chance to retreat, but if they do anything other than that, or enter aggressively, I'm going to shoot and ask questions later. They don't enter. However, because I had also locked the deadbolt inside only, when I first moved in a year prior, I remember thinking that the deadbolt was a great security feature, and I got in the habit of always keeping it locked when I'm home. In hindsight, this decision saved me from a life-or-death confrontation. Upon realizing that, I approached the door and looked through the keyhole. On the other side are 3 Asians, 2 men and 1 woman. All 3 are wearing hoodies, so it's difficult to make out their faces. The men have objects in their hands, but I can't make out exactly what. The 2 men are talking back and forth, probably trying to figure out why they can't open the door, even though they have successfully opened the outside lock at this point. The woman is also talking loudly behind the 2 men, such that anyone in the hallway would be able to hear her voice. She's talking in another language. The only words I can make out are blah blah blah, apartment 250, blah blah blah, and she keeps repeating that over and over like a broken record. Upon hearing that, I start to wonder for a moment if maybe they're just drunk and have the wrong apartment number. But that's impossible. To open my lock, they would have to have a copy of my exact key or some kind of lock-picking device. I've never copied my key or even given it to anyone. And here's the other thing. Not only is 250 not my apartment number, but, as I figured out later, that apartment number doesn't exist anywhere in the complex. Standing back from the door, I take a long broom handle and jab it hard in the face of the door, letting them know that I'm on the other side. They immediately stop fiddling with the lock and take off running. I debate whether to call 911 and decide against it until they return. I know they'll be long gone by the time anyone gets there. It would be too risky to follow them to try and get a better description or license plate, and I don't have enough identifying info as it is to make an arrest. I filed a police report the next day and let the apartment management know. They said it was unusual, but they would alert the resource officer and ask for a police presence for a couple of nights. Nothing ever came of the report, but that's not a surprise to me. It's been 7 months since this happened and no further incidents. Nobody else in the apartment has reported anything similar happening. I don't think they'll be back, but one precaution I took was to buy a smart lock for the deadbolt, so I can leave that deadbolt always locked from the inside, even when I'm not home. It's crazy to think that the deadbolt was the only thing between myself and an armed confrontation with intruders. They say you don't really know what you'll do in those situations until it really happens, but I can honestly say I am proud of how I stayed calm and was mentally prepared to defend myself. If there's one good thing that came out of this, I feel confident that I responded the right way and was ready for the unthinkable. This is my first time posting this story anywhere. I hope you can learn from this experience and apply it if, God forbid, this were to ever happen to you. I work for a company that forces me to travel a lot. I usually fly, but because I know how crazy airports are on holidays, I thought it would be a smarter decision to rent a car and drive home overnight, avoiding the nightmare that would be an airport on Thanksgiving week. I started the drive home, and even though I was a little tired, I was able to cruise from about 11 p.m. until 3 a.m., as there were barely any cars on the road. Shortly after 3 a.m., I saw a van that was sideways in the middle of the road on the highway. Thankfully, I had my brights on and was able to see the vehicle with plenty of time for a safe stop. There was also an elderly woman near the side of the road who was waving me down. Cautiously, I slowed down and came to a stop. The woman walked up to my window, motioning for me to roll it down. I rolled it down the slightest bit, making sure even her hand couldn't get in the car. In an old, cracking voice, she said, "Young man, can you please help me change my tire?" I glanced over and saw that she did indeed have a flat tire. She said to me again, "I ran over something and my tire became flat almost instantly," and motioned to what looked like a piece of plastic in the road. I reluctantly got out of the car and walked by the van and said she needed to move it to the side of the road for safety. I told her that there was no way we could change a tire in the middle of a highway in the middle of the night. She agreed and moved it out of the road into the side of the highway. As I began to change the tire, I had a million things running through my mind. Number one being, why did I have to be the one who got flagged down? I was almost finished taking the flat tire off when I noticed I didn't see the woman anymore, as I was providing my own light source with my cell phone, and looked up to ask if she could assist, and she was gone. I looked all around the vehicle and didn't see anybody. Nothing but pitch black darkness other than my headlights, which were providing some light in the general direction. Well, lucky for me, I had my keys in my pocket and locked my car door when I got out. I walked back over to my car and the woman was there trying to get into my vehicle. I told her to get away from my car before I called the police. She laughed at me and said it would be at least 30 minutes until anyone showed up to where we were. Just as I was trying to get this crazy person away from my car so I could leave, I noticed a man get out of the van. He must have been laying on the floor because I didn't see anybody sitting in the seats when I walked by to begin the process of changing her flat. The man seemed to be of average build. He started to approach me, his hand in his pocket, which really started to make me worry about my safety. The woman then jumped on my back and attempted to choke me. I was able to shake her off quickly and elbow her directly in the throat. She began to cough and gasp incessantly, which gave me the break I needed to get away. The guy who was approaching us devoted his attention to her, and I got in that car and sped away as fast as I could. I have never driven that fast in my entire life. The adrenaline from the events fueled me for the remainder of my trip home. I know if someone else told me this story, I would ask how dumb can you be and emphasize how idiotic of a decision it was to get out of that car. I'm just glad that I was able to get out of that situation unharmed and get home to my family. After police reports were called, I unfortunately never got any further information. I wish I would have glanced at their plates. That may have helped in identifying them later. And please let this be a lesson to everyone out there. Trust your instincts, especially in situations that can affect your safety. This story may seem more weird than truly scary to many of you. At the time, I didn't really find it scary or terrifying myself. I didn't really get that feeling until I shared this with others and got their perspective. I'd be interested to see what, if any, comments any of you have regarding this experience. This event happened with my ex-girlfriend on Thanksgiving about 6 years ago. For the sake of anonymity, we will call her Kay. I met Kay in college, and at first, she was great. We shared similar interests and hobbies. We clicked instantly, and for the first time, I was excited to meet the parents of my significant other. I was going to meet them on Thanksgiving so that everyone could have dinner together. Kay never really mentioned her family, so I was excited and intrigued when she asked me to join her for the holiday. Fast forward a week or so, and Thanksgiving finally comes. I make the 2-hour drive to her parents' house, and my first thought as I approach the house is, wow, this place is huge. It was a gigantic brown mansion. It was very large, but also looked very old. My best comparison is if you have ever seen the movie Clue. The outside of the house looked very similar to that, a mix between mansion and castle almost. I knocked on the door and almost immediately was greeted by a strange-looking guy. He was short, like 5 foot flat. He was bald and wearing an eye patch. I said, "Hey, is Kay here? I'm her boyfriend." He just proceeded to look at me and didn't answer. After a few awkward seconds, Kay walked over and happily greeted me and let me inside. As we walked away, she said in her soft voice, "Oh, don't mind him, that's just Eugene. He's like, I guess, kind of my uncle." Kind of weird way to put it, I thought, but whatever, I didn't think too much of it. As we walked through the house, I was blown away. I'd never seen anything like it. The ceilings were really high and the walls were covered with religious iconography. I wasn't raised with religion, so some of the images were foreign to me. Kay and I arrived and sat in what I assumed was the living room. There was no TV, no radio, just couches and some paintings all over the wall. The paintings seemed to cram together, trying to fit them all on the wall. An odd choice for such a nice home. After a couple of minutes, her parents walked in. Her dad was clean-shaven with wild flowing hair and glasses that were just big enough for his eyeballs, and her mom had long black hair that went all the way down to her back and reached her legs. It looked like they were in their mid-60s if I had to guess. I was introduced and we made small talk. It really wasn't that bad, there was no awkward pauses, but her parents were not what I expected. They seemed a little strange or eccentric, I guess. While the four of us talked basically about school, Eugene came and stood in the doorway and began watching us. After a few more minutes of talking about school, her dad got up and said he had a surprise for us. He walked into the other room and brought out a lime green stereo boombox that looked like something straight out of the 90s. In his almost comical voice, he said, "This one is for you two. I hope you like it. It used to be Kay's favorite." I looked at Kay and she was smiling. I can't even imagine what my face looked like. Confused, surprised, however that translates to a face. He pressed play on the stereo. Music began to play and her dad started to dance with her mom. The music, if that's what you would want to call it, was the weirdest thing I had ever heard in my entire life. It was just like banging of instruments, very untuned instruments and other loud noises that honestly sounded like animals. Even more weird than the song that was playing were the movements of her parents. They just hopped around and were moving their bodies like they were puppets on strings or something. Thankfully, this only lasted a few minutes and we all sat down to dinner. Of course, the dining room was no different than the rest of the house. There were paintings and religious images all over the walls. We ate dinner in a combination of silence and her dad talking about politics and religion and how they were separate yet similar. I basically just stayed quiet and ate my food, which, looking back, was pretty unconventional for Thanksgiving dinner. After the meal, we went back into the living room, and that's when her father told us he had one last surprise for us. In his high-pitched voice, he shouted, "It's now time for our annual Thanksgiving Day celebration." As I sat on the couch and tried to process what that could possibly mean, I noticed that more people were walking into the room. There was somebody dressed as a scarecrow, a teddy bear, a lumberjack, and one other that I think was supposed to be Jesus or some other religious figure. This is when I decided that I had had enough crazy for one night and had to get out of this place. I got up and announced to everyone that I had a family emergency and that I had to leave unexpectedly. I apologized and thanked them for everything thus far and said how happy I was to have met everyone. They all looked a little confused, especially Kay, but they shared their happiness in meeting me and their enjoyment of the night and wished me well on my drive home. As I drove away, I looked through my rearview mirror. I saw Kay and her parents waving goodbye to me from the doorway. Where to begin? This is the weirdest, strangest few hours of my life. I am obviously no longer with Kay, and I honestly am not sure she even came back to school after that because I never saw her in person again. We texted for a few days after the event and she acted like everything was normal. I broke it off before holiday break was over, thinking it would be easier to do so before I saw her in person again. I swear part of me thinks I was on a hidden camera TV show that night or something. Does anyone from a rare religious sect know if any of this is a common tradition? Or was I just in a house with a bunch of crazy people on Thanksgiving? I just wanted to share this short but freaky experience I had with my family many years ago on Thanksgiving. This Thanksgiving, my cousins and I got together with our respective families. I was the oldest of the cousins, 11 at the time. This particular year, our families decided to go to my great aunt's house for dinner. It was a small little farmhouse pretty much in the middle of nowhere. No one liked going there, well, at least us kids, because it was boring and there was nothing to do. My great aunt had recently lost her husband and obviously was very upset, which is mostly the reason our families decided to go there this year. I met my great aunt maybe once or twice in my entire life to this point, so I found this whole trip very weird and really wasn't looking forward to it. Before dinner, all of us kids decided we wanted to play hide and seek. Our parents let us because we could be out of their way, and as previously mentioned, there was nothing else for us to do. My cousin and I went into the basement of the house to hide. There was so much junk and old antiques down there that we could have stayed hidden and out of sight for hours. I climbed to the top of a pile of old newspapers that was backed against a dimly lit wall. I figured if I laid flat at the top, there was no way anyone could find me. Well, after a few minutes, one of my cousins did find me, and when I tried to get down, my foot got caught on something, and I slipped and fell off the side and put a small hole in the wall. At first, we were freaked out because we thought we were going to get in a lot of trouble for doing damage to the house. While we were trying to think of a story to cover it up and get ourselves out of trouble, my brother found a small box on the other side of the wall where I had recently put the hole. We pulled the box out and stared at it for a while, trying to see if we could open it. It had an entire layer of dust on it that didn't come off when we tried to blow on it. My cousin Sarah was fearless, and she grabbed the box from us and opened it. At first, we all felt like we won the lottery. It was filled with 20s, 50s, and hundreds. We were young, but we knew this was a lot of money. As we looked through the money, we eventually got to the bottom of the box, and this is where the excitement vanished. There was a small knife that looked like it had dried blood on it, and next to it was what looked like a skeletal finger or maybe even a toe. Of course, we all screamed and ran upstairs crying to our parents. Our parents looked at us very confused as to what happened. We all tried to blurt out our version of the story until, as calm as can be, my great aunt giggled and said, "Oh, that's just Bob's box from when he used to mess around with his army buddies. I haven't seen that since his friend Raymond passed away." Well, fast forward years later, this story came up again, and we all tried to figure out what all that meant and what we actually found. After consulting with our family, the story goes that our great-uncle Bob was involved in all sorts of crime in the Chicago area. He made a lot of dirty money and eventually gave it up when he had a family. Our family didn't have an answer as to the contents of the box or whose missing finger that could possibly be. Every year for Thanksgiving, my wife and I travel to her parents' house to relax for a few days, watch football, eat tons of food, and go Black Friday shopping. 2 years ago, I was unable to make this trip due to an incident that happened with one of our dogs. On Tuesday night of Thanksgiving week around 11 p.m., I let our golden retriever out to go to the bathroom before I went upstairs to bed for the night. When I came back outside to let her in, she was barking very violently, sounding like she was going after another animal. When she made it into the garbage, it was apparent what happened. She had been sprayed in the face by a skunk. Fast forward 24 hours and we are dealing with a house and a dog that reeks like skunk. Needless to say, I offered to stay home with the 2 dogs while my wife made the trip to her parents. We couldn't travel with the dog, and we certainly needed to do some maintenance to try and get the smell out of the house. My wife left on Wednesday, the same day I took the dog to the groomers and began cleaning and airing out the house. After this experience, I felt it necessary to go outside with the dogs every time I left them out in the backyard, whether it was day or night, to make sure there were no further issues with a skunk. I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary until Wednesday night, when it seemed like our shed doors had been opened slightly. Since it was that time of the year where it got dark out very early in the day, I had grown accustomed to having a flashlight with me to check the backyard before I let the dogs out. Unfortunately, we didn't have a motion light or any sort of light for the backyard, so the only source of light was the flashlight. With the dog still in the garage, I made my way to the shed to see why or what caused the door to be ajar. When I got into the shed, I thankfully didn't see any skunk or any other animal. I did, however, see a dirty towel, which I didn't remember leaving there, but I thought perhaps it was from when I was working on the lawnmower or snowblower. The next 20-ish hours went by without incident. I was spending Thanksgiving alone with my stinky dog in my stinky house, and we were getting ready to go to bed for the night. I did my normal routine of going outside with a flashlight, making sure the coast was clear before I let the dogs out of the garage. However, this time, as I was moving my flashlight across my large backyard, I flashed it towards the side of the shed to illuminate if there was anything behind it. Absolute panic set in as I saw a hooded figure behind the shed. I instinctively started to yell at the figure, asking what they were doing. By the time I went back to the garage to let our dogs out to go after the intruder, he was gone, and there was no one in my backyard. Freaked out, I contacted my wife to let her know what I had seen. She advised me to call the cops, but I decided I would just monitor the backyard for a while and ignore it if nothing further happened. About an hour later, I decided to take the flashlight and go to the window in my kitchen and shine it out into the backyard rather than go outside first. When I did this, the shine of the light caught the same hooded figure going into the shed and shutting the door behind them. At this point, I didn't know what to do. Let the dogs out, call the cops, confront the person myself. I honestly was frozen in shock. Trying to think quickly, and not wanting the person to get away, I grabbed a screwdriver to jam into the openings in the handles to prevent the shed door from opening from the inside. After I did this, I immediately called the police. The person was slamming on the shed, trying anything they could to get out. When the police arrived, they took him away. Thankfully, from the conversation I had with them, he didn't have any weapons on him. I'm not sure what the intent of the person was. Were they just trying to scare me? Were they drunk from drinking all day from Thanksgiving and didn't know where they were? I still have many unanswered questions from that night, including if the person was in the shed the night before and that's why it was left ajar. Perhaps he was just a squatter. Either way, there was no further incident after this issue, and thankfully my dog has also remained skunk-free since then. We now have motion lights installed in our backyard, which will hopefully prevent anyone from trying to break in to our property again. I have worked in retail for many years, and one of my least favorite days to work is Black Friday. Our store is packed to the brim. People are freaking out trying to get their items, and it is very rare to get through the night without any incident. One particular Black Friday sticks out in my memory due to an experience that I had with a customer. I was working out on the floor assisting customers with any questions that they may have had regarding our products or our sales. I had this one customer approach me to complain about not getting a ticket towards one of our better TV offers. I apologized and tried to explain that the tickets had been given out on Thursday night and there was nothing I could do at this point. The customer smelled so bad I could barely get this information out to them without gagging. His clothes were stained and his appearance was ragged. After I explained the scenario to him one more time, a large smile came across his face and he said, "I know it's not your fault, sweetie." I was beyond creeped and grossed out. I let him know that I had to go help other customers, and I hope he had a good conclusion to his evening. A short time later, I got a call up to register to try and assist with the long lines, and wouldn't you know it, I was cashing out the same guy who had been complaining to me just 15 to 20 minutes prior. He began chatting with me, ignoring the fact that he had been irate with me minutes before. He asked my name, even though I had a name tag on, how long I had worked there, how old I was, etc. As I previously mentioned, this person smelled horrific and also began to seriously creep me out with their random questioning. He asked how late I had to work, and I stated that all employees had to stay until midnight due to the fact that we were so busy. Looking back, I probably shouldn't have told him anything. He continued with more creepy questions, and I finally got him out of my line and moved on to the next customers. Fast forward to a few hours later, and I'm finally getting ready to leave after an exhausting day. I walked out to the parking lot with my coworker Matt and said goodbye to him and that I would see him on Sunday. As I made my way to my car, I thought it was unusually quiet, especially for how busy it had been throughout the day, but it was past midnight, so most stores were closed. As I was approaching my car, a set of headlights began to shine in my direction. Blinded by the light, I just proceeded to unlock my car and reach for the handle to get in and leave. The next thing I know, the headlights had made their way right in front of my car and someone was putting their car in park and getting out. To my utter shock and horror, it was the same slovenly customer who had creeped me out earlier in the night. At this point, I started fearing for my safety as this person clearly wasn't all there upstairs. He had parked in front of my car and left his car running, blocking me from going anywhere. We got out of the car and I asked if I could help him and what it was doing blocking my car. He mentioned something along the lines that I needed to come with him and that we belonged together. At this point, I tried to make my way back to the store, but the guy pressed his body weight against me and pressed me against my own car. I couldn't move and was trapped. Fearing for my life, I began to scream as he covered my mouth. His hands somehow smelled worse than his body odor. He began to try and move me towards his car, still trying to muffle my screams while dragging me with his other arm. Just when I thought I was going to be overpowered, a car horn began to honk incessantly. He let go of me and hopped in his car and sped off as quickly as he had arrived. The car that was honking then pulled up to me, and it was Matt. Thankfully, on his way out, he had noticed that there was a car blocking mine and as he got closer, saw that there was someone grabbing me. He immediately got on the phone with the police and began honking as he came over to my side of the parking lot. Matt waited with me for the police to arrive so that we could each give a statement. The cops requested to get into the store so that we could check the camera footage in order to try to get a better view of the guy who had stalked me for the night. To my knowledge, they never caught him, or at least he was never charged. I haven't heard anything from the incident, but I am thankful that I had never seen that person again. And I'm very thankful to Matt for saving me that night. I've always wondered what could have happened if he hadn't been there. For a little bit of background related to this incident, I am a former athletic director of a small elementary school which also sponsors high school basketball teams. This particular event happened on Thanksgiving night 3 years ago. After I had a delicious meal on Thanksgiving with my family, my wife decided she wanted to go Black Friday shopping, so I decided to go to the gymnasium and start setting up for Friday morning. Every Thanksgiving weekend, our gym hosts a Thanksgiving basketball tournament for a handful of local high school teams. It was becoming a pretty well-recognized tradition in our community. Anyway, I spent about an hour or so setting up chairs, bleachers, prepping concessions, and getting the equipment in order. This was perfect because I could now sleep in a little tomorrow morning and not have to worry about rushing to the gym and set up. To try and give you a visual setup of the gym and its surroundings, it is a very small gym with one set of main doors that leads into a small elementary school. The school is very old and the hallways are lined with brick. If I'm being honest, it reminds me of an old prison. The lighting in the halls is dim, even in the daylight due to lack of windows in its construction. The school apparently used to be a home for nuns in the 1930s, and I don't think it's structurally been updated very much since. In my opinion, it's a pretty creepy place. I've been in this place probably 100 times myself, and it still gives me an eerie feeling. Once I finished all my prep work for the tournament, I decided to shut the place down and go home for the night. I went into the far corner of the gym to the circuit breaker and shut off all the lights. At this point, the gym was lit by only moonlight and the glow of street lights shining in through the large gym windows. I walked into the small hallway that was basically pitch black at this point, using my cell phone flashlight to avoid running into a wall. As I walked down the long hall towards the exit, I started to hear a scratching noise. I stopped walking to try and locate the source of the noise because it was very loud and distinct. It sounded like it was coming from one of the classrooms up ahead. As I pointed my cell phone flashlight up the hall, I noticed that one of the classroom doors were open. This was odd because the policy was that all the doors were to be locked when the teachers left for the evening. Admittedly, I was a little spooked, thinking possibly an animal had gotten into the classroom or something else. But the only way to leave was passing the door in the hall to get to the main entrance, which was probably another 30 feet away. I continued down the hall, my eyes sharp to try and find the source of the noise that has now gone silent. As I passed that room, I saw something, and it definitely was not an animal. It was a green figure, a tall green silhouette of a man wearing a button-up shirt, parted hair, and long pants. And I mean tall. It was probably standing about 6.5 feet. It was just standing there, hovering, staring out the door, staring at me. It didn't move or make any noise. Its face was impossible to make out, like staring into the abyss. In the brief moment that I stood there frozen in fear, I felt very cold, like a window had been opened. I don't know why I didn't just run. I think my brain was trying to process if this was a human intruder, or if I was witnessing something I couldn't rationalize. I snapped back to reality and began to sprint down the hall, looking back once more as I ran out the main entrance, now seeing the figure in the hallway. I drove home as fast as I possibly could, not able to get the image of the figure out of my head. Of course, as you would expect every time I relay this story to my family or friends, people either think it's a joke or that I'm trying to scare them. For the rest of that year, I never went to the property by myself after dark. I came and went out the back entrance that was not supposed to be used in order to avoid that hallway. After the season was over, I resigned and appointed someone else to my position. I can't tell you what I saw or experienced that night, but I hope nothing like that ever happens to me again. Christmas is a time of year to be happy, merry, and joyful, at least for most people. I love spreading cheer to family and friends on Christmas. My joyful mood usually translates to my coworkers as well. I work in customer service, which many people know can be a nightmare at Christmas time, so it helps to try and stay upbeat. Well, on this specific Christmas Eve, customers were doing some final Christmas shopping before Christmas Day. Right at the end of my shift, I cashed out a pretty normal-looking guy. I would say the average height range of like 5'7" and maybe 150 pounds. He had parted black hair, glasses, and was probably in his mid-40s. He was buying some fairly normal stuff and not really anything Christmas-related. The whole interaction was mostly friendly until the very end when I said something I now wish I didn't say. I ended our transaction by saying in my bubbly voice, "Thank you, sir, and have a happy holiday." He stopped and turned back to me and said, "What did you just say?" I responded nervously and semi-confused, "Have a happy holiday?" He stormed back to my register and screamed at the top of his lungs, "It's Merry Christmas." I backed away in a slight panic and just said, "Okay, sir, I'm sorry." He walked away mumbling to himself, but I could tell he was furious by his recent actions. For a couple of minutes I kept staring outside and I could see him pacing in front of the store, still seemingly mumbling to himself. A few people actually came into the store and said that there was someone outside talking about Christmas and Jesus' birthday. I began to panic, thinking this guy was going to come into the store again or wait until I got out and try to follow me home or something. Well, luckily for me, my boyfriend worked at the same store, and he was driving us to my mom's house for a Christmas Eve party at the end of the night. We left shortly after 6, and at first I was relieved when I didn't see the man outside. We were almost to my boyfriend's car when we saw the man running after us from the side of the store. My boyfriend opened up the backseat door so I could hop in, and he stood there in front of the car. My boyfriend said in a stern voice, "Hey, is there a problem, man?" The man, still in a rage, said, "That lady has no respect for Jesus or Christmas, and she should be punished." My boyfriend, confused, told the man to back away and leave us alone, and the crazy man actually tried to jump past my boyfriend to get into the car to punish me or whatever that meant. My boyfriend slammed the guy down to the ground and got into the car, and we drove off. Like fools, we decided on the drive not to call 911 because we didn't want to bother them on Christmas Eve, so we thought, and just wanted to forget the event. On December 26th, we did alert our store manager of the situation so we could call the police if the guy ever came back into the store. I still work at the store, and almost a year later, I have never seen that man again. I can say for certainty that I will never say happy holidays again. I love Christmas. It has always been a great day to spend with my family, and call me cheesy, but I really just enjoy the spirit of the day. My whole family and I had just finished a beautiful Christmas dinner, and most of my family went into the living room to wait for me to exchange presents. Christmas Day was when we did presents with the grandparents and cousins. I was in the kitchen washing dishes with my brother Jake and cousin Teresa. While I was washing dishes, I looked out the window and thought I noticed somebody out by my shed. I didn't really let it bother me because I figured it was some kind of shadow from the tree. After a few more minutes of washing, I noticed the figure again, and this time I was definitely sure that it was a man. I told my brother and cousin to look out the window, but don't make it obvious. They noticed it as well. We all talked quietly among ourselves, trying to figure out what we should do. Our thought was that this man was technically trespassing in my backyard, so we decided to call the police. They told us that they would send somebody out to take a look right away. Trying not to panic and hoping everything stayed how it was until the police showed up was not easy. The kids started to get restless as well as the grandparents were wondering what was the holdup. My parents knew something wasn't right, but they did a really great job of keeping everybody in the living room. After a couple of minutes, we noticed the man starting to approach my house, and he wasn't alone. There were 3 more men that came out from behind the shed. They started to surround my house. Confused and terrified, we tried to remain calm. What happened next was nothing shy of a Christmas miracle. The flashing lights appeared and we heard a minor altercation outside of the house. The officers were able to catch one of the men while the other 3 fled. While somehow not bringing a lot of attention to my family inside, I spoke with the cop outside and gave my statement. Well, turns out my cousin Teresa had broken up with her boyfriend several months before Christmas, and the man they detained was, in fact, her ex-boyfriend. Teresa had started seeing somebody new, and this man figured the new boyfriend would be at the house for the Christmas party. Her ex and his friends clearly planned on attacking him, or at least putting a good scare into him, so I thought. Until the officer informed us that my cousin's ex was equipped with a knife and brass knuckles in his back pocket. Luckily, nobody got hurt, and I'm not actually sure what kind of trouble he got into for this. The rest of the night went smooth, and we opened presents, but I had an uneasy feeling for the rest of the night that the other men might return and try to finish the plan they started. Being the father of 2 small children, Christmas Eve is usually a very early night for my family because the kids wake me up around 6 a.m. for Santa's presents. At about 10 p.m., I got into bed with my wife and started to fall asleep. Shortly after this, I was jolted awake by our doorbell. I jumped out of bed and ran down the stairs, more angry than anything else that some idiot rang my doorbell on Christmas Eve after 11 p.m. with 2 small children asleep. Without even thinking, I opened the door and said, "What do you want?" It was an old man with a dirty black beard. He was wearing a red jacket and red sweatpants. His face was filthy. He said in a slow and haunting voice, "Please, let old Kris Kringle come inside and get warm." I slammed the door in his face and said through the door, "If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the cops." The man was quiet for a moment, and then knocked on the door slowly. I yelled one more time, trying not to wake my kids. "Do you want to be arrested?" He then started to bang on my door vigorously and relentlessly. My wife then ran down the stairs, who I might add is a 3rd-degree black belt, and asked what was going on. I told her to call the police and then make sure the kids were all right. The man must have heard me on the phone because he stopped knocking. I could hear him muffled through the door say, "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night." And then he laughed as he walked away. After feeling a slight moment of relief thinking this ordeal was over, I decided to wait at the front door until the police showed up. A cop showed up several minutes later, and I explained the situation to him. He stated that he had no other calls or similar reports like this tonight, and that's when we heard my wife scream from the kids' room. The police officer headed up the stairs first, with me right behind him. The man was trying to break into the window where my daughter slept. The cop immediately tased and arrested the man, who just kept saying, "Don't worry, I'm Santa Claus," over and over again. The situation was never really explained to me. Apparently he was just a homeless man who was wandering around. The cops said that he may have been possibly on something. Either way, I never sleep quite right on Christmas anymore. First, let me say I come from a somewhat unconventional family. We are all a little weird or wacky in our own way. Sometimes we get along great, and sometimes not so much. On Christmas Day, my parents and I usually stay home and don't see any of our extended family. However, this past year, we decided to go to my grandmother's house. This is a little different because my grandmother and I have a very rocky relationship with one another. I have overheard my dad mentioning stories about my grandmother and my now deceased grandfather that bordered on child abuse. I remember being really young, and my grandparents screaming at me for the smallest things, and my parents abruptly taking me home. But anyway, I'm in my 20s now, and my father decided since it was Christmas, we could give spending the holiday at my grandma's a chance. The day started out pretty uneventful and, dare I say, pleasant. A lot of conversations and happy memories. My dad and aunt were reminiscing about snowball fights and such from their childhood. There was a healthy conversation about politics, which I thought for sure would change the mood, but surprisingly did not. After several hours and a nice dinner, everyone made their way to the living room for coffee and to just hang out on the couches. I left my coffee on the kitchen table and made my way to the back of the house where the only bathroom was. I washed my hands, fixed my shirt, and walked out of the bathroom. When I walked into the hallway, I was greeted by my grandma, who was just standing there staring at me. I said, "Hi, what's going on?" And I tried to keep walking, but she wouldn't move. Now this is a narrow hallway and you're only fitting one across. "Excuse me, please," I said, semi-annoyed, yet still she did not budge at all. Finally she spoke up and said, "What do you think you're doing?" She sounded nervous and almost a little angry. "I was just going to the bathroom," I said, starting to get uneasy about the entire situation. She started to poke my chest and said, "Where is he?" At this point, I was beyond confused. I told her I had no clue what she was talking about. Where's who? I finally shoved past her and started to make my way down the long hallway. That's when it happened. I heard her scream like a banshee and chase me down the hall. I turned around and she lunged at me with a small kitchen knife. She was trying to stab me. She just kept screaming, "Where is he? Where is he?" At this point, she had fallen to the ground trying to take me down with her. After a minute of this, my father finally came running in with my aunt and lifted her up. I was too scared to use any force because I didn't want to hurt her, but I also didn't want to get stabbed. I was so angry and upset I started to grab my things and told my family I was leaving. As I made my way toward the door, she walked back into the living room and said in a calm voice, "Oh, where are you going? You haven't even finished your coffee." I just left and didn't even respond. This woman, my grandmother, tried to stab me, and I still have no idea why. I found out several weeks later from my cousin that after my father and I left, my grandmother cried for hours and was basically inconsolable. She didn't know why we were so angry and left so abruptly. Clearly, my grandma had some sort of episode that night that she can't remember, but there are so many unanswered questions like, who was she referring to? I haven't seen or spoken to her since. My dad did try to reach out and explain to her why we left and why we won't be coming back, but she doesn't believe he is telling her the truth when he transcribes the events back to her. The worst part about all of this is that this will probably be the Christmas that I always remember the most. This is a short story that happened to me approximately 3 to 4 years ago. I used to work for a charitable company that would distribute presents to families or individuals in need during the holiday time. For the most part, I loved this job. It paid decently well and was incredibly rewarding. But on this one specific Christmas Eve, it was enough for me to never want to do something like this again. I usually worked or traveled with another associate named Jose, but since it was Christmas Eve and it was our last stop, I told him I would go alone, and he could go home to his wife and enjoy what was left of the holiday. It was about 5 p.m., so it was getting pretty dark as I made my way toward the recipient's house. I arrived and went up to the door with a big tote of presents all wrapped and ready to be distributed as they pleased. A man answered the door in pajama pants and a skin-tight sleeveless shirt. The guy was overweight and clearly did not take care of himself. He looked like he hadn't shaved or showered in weeks. I said to him in my still bubbly voice, "Hi, I'm Jamie, and I'm here to drop off the presents." He stared at me and smiled with his yellow, unbrushed teeth. He looked right at me and said, "Wow, you sure are pretty," which freaked me out a little bit. I just awkwardly smiled and said, "Thanks." He then said, "Honey, I have a lot of trouble with my back and I can't lift these presents. Will you please bring them into my living room for me?" Like a fool, I complied, as this wasn't an uncommon request to bring the presents in the home for those receiving them. I walked in, and the man shut the door behind me. I walked slowly in his near pitch-black house. What I noticed in the few seconds of being in this house was that there were no signs of children, Christmas decorations, or anything that even looked remotely festive. I turned around to ask him where I was going, and that's when I noticed him. He was hunched over and staring at me like I was a piece of meat, basically salivating. He started to approach me and put his arms out like he was going for an embrace or a hug. More creeped out than I've ever been in my entire life, I decided the answer was to just run away. I dropped the presents there and ran to the door. He locked it behind me. The knob was locked, and so was the chain. I quickly was able to get them undone and out of the house without any further incident. I got into my car and called my supervisor and explained the situation to him. What he told me next made my eyes fill up with tears. I had mixed up 2 of the numbers in my GPS when I set out for the house. I was on the wrong block and clearly at the wrong house. The guy wasn't expecting presents and played along to get me into his house. I have no idea what his intentions were and am thankful nothing else happened. Running through the scenario in my head makes me wonder how I was able to undo the locks before he grabbed me or made a move towards the door. However, his pause in action or change of heart may have very well saved my life. The traumatizing events of this story happened to me several years ago. This is the first time I'm sharing my story publicly in hopes it may help others who read it. At the time, I was a mother of a 4-year-old daughter. Her name is Juniper, and she is my entire life. The day of these events, my husband was at work, so I decided to do some Christmas shopping at the mall. On the way in, Juniper saw Santa sitting in the middle of the atrium and began jumping because I assumed she associated Santa with presents. We decided to get into line, even though it was long. We could get a picture and she could tell Santa what she wanted for Christmas. When it was finally Juniper's chance to sit on his lap, I immediately felt uncomfortable. I didn't like the way he was staring at her. His eyes were big and looked as if though he had been on something. She sat there for a moment and told the man what she wanted as I watched, filled with anxiety. After about 2 minutes, he got her off his lap and winked goodbye to her and said Merry Christmas. Happy this ordeal was over, we did the little bit of shopping we had to do and pressed on through the day. While I was browsing around one of the clothing stores, I looked up and thought I noticed the mall Santa sitting outside of the store we were in. Not taking any chances, I grabbed Juniper and walked out of the other entrance of the store. After a little while longer of shopping, we decided to get some lunch in the food court of the mall. I kept my eyes peeled because I just had Mother's intuition that something wasn't right. We were finishing our food, and literally as we were about to get up, the mall Santa came over to our table. He walked right up to Juniper and said in a jolly Santa-like voice, Hey there, Juniper. Remember to be good so Santa can come and bring you lots of presents. She was so excited, and so were all the people around me. It's easy to say what you would do in that situation, but I just stood still. I thought freaking out my daughter and rushing her away from Santa would be a traumatizing event, so I grabbed her hand and told her it was time to go. She said goodbye to Santa, and we left. That night at home, I told my husband about the entire story. He was angry, but agreed with my course of action. The next day, I woke up at about 8 a.m. My husband was already gone for work for the day. I happened to look outside and saw a strange blue car that I had never noticed parked outside my house. This didn't really bother me considering it could have been anyone, but it was just peculiar. At about 11 a.m., I looked out the window again and noticed the car was still in the exact same spot. I made the choice to go out to my mailbox in the front of my home and investigate the car. The car was empty, except for the passenger seat. There was a Santa hat on the seat. I tried not to jump to any conclusions, but it was just starting to make too much sense in my head. I ran inside and called my husband. He said I was grasping at straws, but decided to come home anyway to make sure I was okay. A couple of minutes later, my worst fear was realized. I looked out the window and saw the man in his car. It was the mall Santa, and he was taking a picture of my house with his cell phone. Once he saw me, he drove away, and he drove away so fast I couldn't get the license plate number. Minutes later, my husband came home and I explained what I saw. We called the authorities, but there really wasn't anything that could be done. I felt angry with myself that I looked at the car all morning and couldn't get a license plate number. My husband stayed home from work the next day just in case. At about noon, we walked around the house and noticed footprints outside of Juniper's window. Footprints in the snow that neither of us left. That night, I couldn't sleep. I felt like I was just waiting for something horrible to happen. My husband, Juniper, and I all decided to have a camp out in the living room so she could be with us all night. Shortly after midnight, my husband and I were alerted to the sound of a car pulling up. It was the mall Santa car from the day before, and he was approaching the house with a giant bag in his hand. I called the police, as my husband stalked him through the windows. The lights were off, so the mall Santa couldn't see us through the windows. He made his way all the way to Juniper's window. He started to tap on the windows, almost as if though he was trying to wake her up. My husband stood on the other side of the window, trying not to scare him away until the cops came. That's when we heard it. "Hey, Juniper, it's Santa. Come take a ride in my sleigh and I'll show you the reindeer." Praying that the cops would show up any minute, I sat in the fetal position, not knowing if this lunatic had a gun or any other weapon. He kept tapping and whispering, "It's me, Santa." Finally, the cops showed up, and when we heard the sirens out front, my husband jumped out the window and tackled the mall Santa. My husband yelled for the cops, and the cops detained the man. He didn't have any weapons on him, but his car did have duct tape and rope. It gives me nightmares to this day, thinking of that horrible situation and what could have happened. My Christmas miracle is that my family is safe, and my daughter didn't have to really experience any of the intense feelings my husband and I did over those couple of days. If you as a parent have instincts about the safety of your child, please follow them. If I would have just left the mall when I felt uneasy, I could have possibly avoided this entire series of events. This happened 2 years ago, but I always think about it. Every Christmas Eve, we spend the evening at my grandparents' house where we have a feast and swap presents with cousins, all the people we won't be with on Christmas morning. It was a merry and festive evening, and spirits were high, if not a little worn out, on our way home. Pulling into our driveway, we instantly felt something was off. The corner of our house decoration lights were hanging haphazardly free of the roof, and something else we couldn't quite pinpoint right away. Luckily, the kids were already asleep from the soothing dark car ride, so we sat in the driveway, the motor off and ticking as it starts to cool. Did we leave that many lights on inside? My husband asked me, because he would never. He is a stickler for turning out lights before we leave. I shook my head no. The Christmas tree was the only thing we left on, but now there was a soft glow from the windows at two ends of the house, one being the primary living room area toward the front where we were, and the other the window at the left side of the house, the hallway by our bedroom, and it slightly lit the side yard between our house and the neighbor. We both agreed that it looked like someone was or had been in our home. "Call the cops. Stay in the car with the doors locked." He recranked the car, and I didn't even bother getting out. I just slid over the center console into the driver's seat just in case. He has a concealed carry permit, so he drew his weapon and went to check the front door. It was still locked, so he unlocked it about the time I started telling the police that our house seemed suspicious and we thought someone might be in it. They, of course, said that we should wait outside, but I knew that there was no use in telling my husband that, as he was already starting inside and flicking on more lights. It was nerve-wracking to sit there and watch the open front door spilling light onto the lawn. I cracked my window just the tiniest bit so I could hear sooner if something started happening. Luckily, nothing did, and when the cops pulled up, I let them know my husband was inside and what he was wearing since he did have his gun out. But all the opening and shutting of car doors alerted him and woke the kids, so he'd come back to the front door with his gun back under his jacket. I went back to keep the kids busy while he talked to the cops, and then the cops cleared the house. Our visitors were no longer there, but they had broken in through the backyard. Many of our Christmas presents were gone, the heaviest ones it seemed, as I'd bought most of them, and they had left one of their own, a large pile of poop on the back porch mat. Decorations I had up inside were knocked down and scattered all over the place, the tree completely disheveled. 2 pieces from my nativity scene were smashed on the floor. Our laptops were gone, and my jewelry box had also been pilfered. But unbeknownst to them, although some had sentimental meaning, that was all custom or low-level stuff. Anything real was in our hidden safe they had not found. My husband made sure not to touch the light switches that had been on so that they could dust for prints, and other evidence was taken, and we gave a report for the theft. It seems they spent a while inside the house without much fear, brazenly turning on lights, leaving a steaming pile, and, maybe as they left, hopping up and tearing the Christmas lights off the corner of the house. No out-of-the-place fingerprints came back, so they must have been wearing gloves, and it remains unsolved. Next year, I asked for a security system for Christmas. This happened in the summer, and I believe I was about 12 at the time. I was staying in a hotel in a fairly large city with my mom and my younger brother. We were visiting our extended family, but chose not to stay in their house. My brother is younger than me by a decent amount, so I was usually told to keep an eye on him. On the day we arrived, my mom told me to do just that while she checked us in and received our room card. So my brother and I sat down on the couch in the lobby and relaxed a little bit. While we were sitting, a man in about his mid-40s walked into the hotel. The couch was facing the hotel doors, so I got a good look at him. I remember that he was very average-looking. Describing his features and details could generate several different images. The guy comes in and sits on the couch opposite ours. I didn't think anything of it until I realized that he didn't go up to the counter first. He just came in and sat down. It made me feel a little uncomfortable. I thought that he might have followed us in. Thankfully, my mom called us over and told us that our room was ready. We left the lobby and went to our room. Shortly after, we left the hotel to go meet family. I forgot about the man for the rest of the day. We returned at about 7, and my mom told us that we could go swimming in the hotel pool. We all went to our rooms, changed, and went to the pool. A few minutes after we got into the water, the same man from before walked in and sat down. He was wearing jeans and a sweater, so he definitely wasn't going swimming. Again, we didn't think much of it, until I could see that my mom was visibly worried. She pointed him out to me and said that if he didn't leave within 5 minutes, we needed to go back to our rooms. 5 minutes passed and he was still there, so we got our things and left. By then, it was close to 8. We had brought a rented movie to watch, so we planned to watch that and go straight to bed. I noticed that my mom was a little on edge because of the man watching us, and I got a little more worried myself too. Halfway through the movie, my mom got up to get in the shower. While she was in there, Someone knocked on the door and said, "Housekeeping," in a high-pitched voice. I thought it was weird that the cleaning staff would come this late, but we needed another towel, so I answered the door. I wish I hadn't been so stupid. It was the creepy man. He gave me a smile and a little wave. I just stood there, kind of motionless. My mind automatically went to the worst possible situation: kidnapping, torture, etc. I heard the water in the shower turn off. He stood there as well for a moment, and then he spoke. "How was your swim?" At that moment, my mom came out of the shower, saw the man at the door, pulled me back, and slammed the door. She locked it. Then she called the front desk from our hotel phone to report the guy. I told her to just call the police, but she didn't listen. She then requested we switch rooms. I then heard footsteps stomping down the hallway away from our room. Thankfully, the guy had left. After that, we switched hotel rooms and didn't see the guy again during our stay. A while ago, I was staying in an upscale hotel in the safe area of a large Midwestern city. I'm a 16-year-old female, and I was in a room all by myself, with my parents a few doors down. In theory, this isn't unsafe by any means, but I had bad luck on this particular trip. Our first night there passed without incident, me in my room, my parents in theirs. I watched a pay-per-view movie and ate way too much from the snack bar. I didn't have any reason to feel unsafe. The next morning, we did the usual tourist stuff that one does when visiting a new city. As we ate breakfast in the hotel restaurant, I noticed a man who looked to be in his 60s staring at me for an abnormally long amount of time. I won't lie. As a young, decently attractive female, I'm used to getting the occasional inappropriate look from a guy, so I ignored it and chalked it up to him either being a perv or thinking I looked like his granddaughter or something. The next night, my parents allowed me to meet up with a friend for dinner who lived in the area. He met me in the hotel lobby, and we had a nice dinner and then went back to the hotel for drinks. Yes, I know I'm underage. Coincidentally, the same man who had been eyeing me earlier was at the bar. This time, I knew I didn't remind him of his granddaughter. Even with my buff guy friend next to me, his eyes traced every curve of my body. I felt unsettled and mentioned it to my friend, Ethan, who glanced over and also seemed really weirded out by how obvious this guy was leering. We left the bar quickly, and by now it was around 12:30 a.m. Ethan walked me to the elevators of the hotel, and once I pushed the button, left. I wish I would have asked him to stay, because no sooner had he walked away than my creeper came rolling around the corner and stood there waiting with me for the elevator. I felt so uncomfortable knowing that he would be seeing what floor I was going to, but it hadn't occurred to me to get off on a different floor at the time, and even if it did, he planned on following me, so it would have been just as bad a move. When we were in the elevator together, I tried to keep my eyes averted from his, but they literally bore into my body. He kept trying to step closer, and I kept backing up, too scared to even speak. What freaked me out even more was that he hadn't pressed a separate elevator button, so he planned on getting off when I did. When I got to my floor, I almost ran to my room, and the guy just stood at the end of the hallway, waiting to see where I was going. I stayed in my room for 15 minutes until I was sure he was gone before I told my parents what had happened. They were freaked out and told the hotel staff, but there was no sign of the guy, and it was really late, so I just locked my door and tried to get some sleep. I had almost drifted off when I heard a knock at my door. No, I'm not an idiot. I didn't just go and open the door at nearly 2 a.m. Instead, I turned on the light and froze. At this point, my intuition had kicked in and I knew it was the guy. I was near tears, but the knocking kept continuing, harder and harder, so I finally shouted and asked who it was. The voice that replied to me was the most chilling thing I had ever heard, high-pitched but growly, almost giggly, so disturbing I can barely describe it. "It's hotel staff. Please let me in." I was terrified. A look through the peephole confirmed that it was the same creepy old guy. I locked myself in the bathroom and called my dad's phone. He has a habit of always keeping his ringer on, so he answered me almost immediately, and I tried to tell him what was wrong through my tears. The guy from before, I managed, is at my door. And what happened next gives me nightmares. My dad naturally went into superhero mode and opened his door to find the old man in just a robe, masturbating. It's pretty obvious to piece together what he was planning, and I still dream about it and have severe PTSD from it. My dad slugged the dude in the face and made sure he didn't move an inch while my mom called hotel security. We pressed charges, and the guy is in prison now on what I think are assault with intent to force himself upon me. I've recently moved to a new town and have been job hunting. I stopped by a hotel on the shoreline and went in to see if they needed someone for desk work. Inside was vacant, dark, and smelt stale. The man behind the desk had an extremely thick accent and it was difficult for me to understand him. It seemed like he was the only person in the whole building and I got a strange vibe from the whole place, but stayed to fill out the application and turn it in as quickly as possible. I could feel him staring at me the entire time. The man muttered something under his breath and took my application. After I left, I decided most likely I would not be accepting a position there because of the strangeness of the situation, and really regretted leaving my phone number, address, and other personal info on the application. Later that evening, I'm at home watching the Olympics in my living room, around 10 or so. I go into my bedroom to grab my phone off the charger, and I see I have a missed call from just a few minutes earlier. It's strange for anyone to be calling me so late, but I redialed the number to satisfy my curiosity. A woman with a thick accent answers and demands to know who is calling. I politely told her that I had missed a call from this number. She starts screaming, "No, no, no, Samantha!" at the top of her lungs and hangs up. It freaked me out that she had used my name in her crazy talk, but figured it was some crackhead that misdialed my number. I take my phone back with me into the living room and sit down. Right then my phone starts ringing again. I answer, and it's the man from the hotel yelling my name over and over again. He is screaming at the top of his lungs and I can hear the woman yelling too. I could catch pieces of what they were saying, but in between their accents and both of them screaming, it was difficult to get it all. I heard, "Disturb my phone. Disturb your life. You can't see." And that's about it. I hung up really fast and proceeded to flip out. They called back 14 times within about 20 minutes. Thankfully, I don't have my voicemail set up, so they couldn't leave any. My husband came home at around midnight, and I told him what happened. He laughed it off and said they were probably on drugs and just dialed my number to mess with me. I really hated the fact that these people had a decent chunk of my personal information, but I figured they were too crazy to do anything but make creepy phone calls at night. I finally calmed down enough to go to sleep at around 3 in the morning. About half an hour later, I wake up to my dog barking, growling, and charging at the back door. I know immediately something is wrong because she never acts like this and is well trained. My husband and I both sprinted into the living room and saw a hand reaching through the doggy door, clawing at the tile. I screamed and my husband grabbed me, and we went into the bedroom and locked the door. I dialed the police and thankfully they were there within 10 minutes. The man was long gone, but I knew exactly who it was. I gave them my statement and showed them my call log from earlier. They called the number, but it was a prepaid phone, so there wasn't a lot they could do to trace it. By the time the police left, it was around 5:30 in the morning, which was okay with me since I wouldn't be able to sleep anyways. A few hours later, my husband, who was still really angry, and I decided to go to the hotel to try to get some information about the guy and inform the staff that this guy was nuts. We spoke to the manager there, and he told us that the man I described had been fired a year ago for stalking a housemaid. Oh my God, what was he doing in the lobby last week then? They checked the security cameras and discovered that he was constantly around the hotel and staring in the windows. I guess he had snuck in while the manager left the desk right as I walked in. The manager contacted the police and was able to file trespassing charges against him. Now at least the police are looking for him. At this point, I'm in tears. I had given a crazy person all my info and he was harassing and stalking me. I'm still receiving phone calls from strange numbers during the night, but luckily he hasn't returned to the house, as far as I know. I contacted my references I had used on my application to let them know what was going on. Apparently, my old boss was left a voicemail at around 2 in the morning on Monday of heavy breathing and some strange moaning noises. This past week, I haven't been able to sleep at all. I'm a nervous wreck and jump out of my skin every time my phone rings or I hear my dog barking. So I get a message on a dating site from a girl. Not my type, but I check the message out. "Hey, you're super hot. Want to come over to my hotel room?" I was flattered, but definitely was not interested. However, she might be a good person, so I messaged her back. "Not really looking for that, but I'm down to chat." "No, I really want you to come over. I'm on vacation, and I'm at the hotel near your house." Once again, I say, "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested. Where are you from, and why choose here to vacation to?" "I'm from here, but I'm at a hotel wanting you to smash. Come over." At this point, I was sketched out. Why rent a hotel room when you live here? It's a smaller city. So I did the smart thing. I blocked her. I sent a message beforehand saying goodbye and hope she finds someone that is interested. Fast forward 30 minutes. She made a second account and sent me this. "I'm serious. I really want you to come over. Here's something to persuade you." And it was an Imgur link to a picture of a naked woman in a bed. So I block her again. Not even 15 minutes went by and there was another account and message from her. At this point, I think I'm getting trolled. My friends could easily have pulled this off. I wanted to call their bluff, so I created a new Kik account, gave my info, and told her to go on video. I was going to catch my friends. Well, it was her. She quickly went into doing things trying to persuade me. I deleted the Kik and avoided it. Deleted my dating account. Was completely sketched out. About 2 months later, I reactivated it one lonely night. About a day later, I get a message from her saying that she saw me riding my bike downtown a few weeks ago. She described what I was wearing. I had enough. I told her I could take this to the police for harassment. I actually didn't know if I had a good case, but I wanted to scare her away. It worked. Hadn't heard a peep since. I'd never been more grateful to think with my brain instead of my other head. So my girlfriend and I got a motel for 2 nights. It was not the best motel, not on the best side of town, but it was cheap, so it worked for us. I was 20 and she was 19 at the time. Anyways, the first night went fine. However, the second night things started to get strange. At about midnight there was a banging on her door. I looked out the peephole to see a scraggly-looking shorter white man standing outside my door with jeans on and no shirt. My first thought was that this guy was probably on drugs or something. It was probably banging on everyone's door for whatever reason. Whatever, I'm tired. Time to go to sleep. Then, about 2 a.m., as my girlfriend and I are starting to fall asleep, I think I hear the man say something outside. "You and your girl are gonna die tonight." Now, I tried to trick myself into thinking that I didn't really hear this. I mean, why would some random stranger say this? How did he even know I had a girl in the room? Had he been watching us earlier? All these thoughts are going through my mind while my girlfriend is asleep. Her name is Jane. I don't want to disturb her, but at this point, I'm feeling pretty nervous, so I nudge her awake. I say quietly, "I think that guy is still outside." She is half asleep and thinks I'm being paranoid. He begins to knock on her door again. Alarmed, we get up to look through the peephole. This time he is standing in front of our door, but looking the opposite direction with his hands behind his back, almost militaristically. I begin calling the police from the motel phone. Jane thought I was overreacting, but I was too afraid not to call. I told the police about the man and they said they would send somebody out. I called the lobby and told them as well, but they said they couldn't do anything and that I should call the police. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, actually a pretty decent response time, a police car rolls through the parking lot. Then they leave. What? They must not have seen the guy. Great. Now this guy starts talking more craziness outside. He says stuff along the lines of, "Man, you called the cops? You're just a freaking baby. I'm gonna beat you to death." But stops shortly after, and we didn't hear anything from him for another 10 to 15 minutes. Then again outside I hear him say, "You and your girl are gonna die tonight." Jane heard him this time as well, and she instantly was on my level of terrifiedness. and she hadn't heard this before and insinuated I was over-paranoid or hearing things. She insisted we call the police, and this time I let her talk to them. She was much more shooken up on the phone and conveyed a necessary sense of urgency I wasn't capable of. Again, a police cruiser comes through the parking lot. I see the car is about to leave again. Angry, I walked outside to the cruiser. I felt safe enough to walk outside since the police were right there. I asked why they were leaving, and they said that they talked to the guy, but he wasn't doing anything obviously criminal, so they couldn't do anything about it. The officer said he was messing with the air conditioner to our room. I explained to the officer the comments we heard this man making about killing us, but again, he told me there was nothing he could do. Oh my God, right? So the cops leave again. They leave me and my girlfriend alone at this motel with this crazy guy for the second time. Now he's angry and must have seen me talking to the cops. Again, he's knocking on our door, calling me a little baby, saying he's gonna kill me. So I call the cops for the third time. About 15 minutes later, I heard the sound of handcuffs outside my room. I had never felt so relieved. I don't know what happened and why they finally decided to arrest him. I'm just glad that they did. I could hear him saying, "What did I do? I didn't do anything," while they were cuffing him. As soon as the police were gone, my girlfriend and I left the motel. Luckily, my friend was awake at 4 a.m. when I called him, and we crashed at his house for the night. When we were pulling out of the motel parking lot, I could see the man in the back of the police car looking at me. The deadest and most soulless eyes I had ever seen. I was 14 when this occurred, and I'm 22 now, but I still remember in crisp detail, and it freaks me out to this day thinking about what could have happened if things turned out differently. School was out for summer, and I had convinced my mom to send me to Russia for a couple of months to visit my grandparents. We moved to North America when I was little, and I hadn't been back much since. Plus, I thought it would be fun being on my first trip abroad by myself. She agreed, and off I went on my first solo transatlantic journey. My grandparents are great people and have always spoiled me and my mom rotten, and they were ecstatic their only granddaughter wanted to visit, so they planned a little vacation of their own with me a month after I arrived to a popular beach resort city in Turkey. We were to stay at a 5-star resort in Ankara for 2 weeks. I thought that was spectacular, getting to travel to not one, but 2 countries in one summer, and to a fancy exotic place like Turkey. I was dying to go. But, full disclosure, when I arrived to Russia, it wasn't really what I was expecting. My grandparents are really protective people, and I couldn't do much or go anywhere by myself, so it got boring pretty fast, and I spent most of my days playing PSP in my room. I was also accustomed to being active and wanted to do things like go jogging, which I did every day at home, so I gave my grandparents a hard time about this since they wouldn't let me go alone, and naturally they couldn't really keep up. Then after about a month, the time came to go to Turkey, and I was super excited to finally get some freedom and a change of scenery. I had been pent up at home too long. The resort they had picked was sprawled over a pretty large area. However, it was all very well secured and isolated from the rest of the city, and there was also a huge garden on the property which was ideally suited for jogging. This time, I had my own room separate from my grandparents, so I took this chance to go off by myself and explore the grounds. Most of the time, I would go jogging in the mornings when it was cooler with my big old iPod, so I couldn't hear anything that was going on around me, but I figured it was pretty safe since it was a nice hotel with plenty of tourists. Then I started to notice him. A pretty innocuous-seeming gardener in his late 40s, early 50s in a green uniform. I remember he looked like a shriveled old date from too many years in the sun. He would always wave or say something in broken English as I passed by while he trimmed the shrubs or mowed the lawn. I would politely wave back, smile or nod, but I didn't really pay much attention. Fast forward about 10 days, and I was really enjoying myself. It was fun to swim in the pool and the sea, the food was great, and my grandparents had let up a lot so I could do more by myself. However, they didn't know about my morning runs in the gardens, and I wasn't going to tell them because I wasn't sure they would approve. So one morning at around 7 a.m. while I'm jogging, I see the gardener again, but this time it's clear he's trying to get my attention. He waves at me and yells something, so I stop and pull out my earphones, trying to figure out what he wants. Now, I know he works for the hotel, so I don't really suspect anything. He waves at me again and motions me to come forward. I'm confused, but I figured he wants to tell me something, so I politely approach. He's standing at a trail that goes deeper into the gardens and foliage. He's smiling and gesturing, and I can see he's holding something in his hand. "Rosa," he says. "Beautiful Rosa." Then I notice he's holding a rose and extending it to me. At this point I'm confused and a little freaked out about what he's thinking, but I stay put. Usually the hotel staff there are chatty, but nice enough. My grandparents would always get pulled into conversations with him about things. I figured it's something like this now, and I don't want to be rude, but still want to be on my way without offending the old man. He hands the flower to me and I take it, thinking maybe he wants to show me some roses that are in bloom, but he keeps waving and gesturing, like he wants me to follow him, and stupidly I walk closer. He has another flower in his hand, and he backs away more. Then suddenly he stops and starts to lower it a little. That's when I notice he's holding his other hand behind his back too, and he's holding something. I look ahead up the trail and see a little cabin-type thing where I assume they keep their gardening supplies. Something clicks in my head then, and I instantly back away. He sees me do that and tries to smile, saying, "Rosa," again, and moves the hand he's holding behind his back while lurching toward me. That's when I see he's holding some kind of rag. Without hesitation, I drop the rose he handed me, turn around, and run for it at full speed. I don't stop to look back and run like mad back to the hotel. It's not until the doors close behind me and I'm among other people that I look back and see if he's followed me. I don't see him anymore and my heart is beating like crazy. I go back to my hotel and wait for my grandparents to wake up. I never told them any of what happened that day and spent the rest of my vacation glued to their side. I thought that if I'd said anything, they would get even more paranoid about my safety and blame me for wandering off on my own. Also, I didn't want to ruin the remaining days for them. I saw the gardener once more on the beach. I remember him talking to a security guard. I remember growing very uncomfortable and sinking into my sun chair when I saw him. Then he looked at me and smiled. I scowled at him as he mouthed the word Rosa tauntingly and smiled again. I still remember the anger bubbling in my stomach and how much I wanted to cleave his face in, but I just froze and stared. He walked away, and I went back to pretending nothing ever happened. Needless to say, I never went on any more morning jogs, and neither did I want to until long after the summer had ended, and I'd returned back home. When I was about 16, I went on a trip to Cabo San Lucas with my family and my best friend. My friend and I had a hotel room to ourselves for the trip, something I was naturally excited about. One afternoon, I was getting on the elevator and a security guard got on with me. As the elevator rose, he looked at me and said, "Excuse me, were you wearing a green skirt on the beach the other day?" Yes, why?" I replied. I was already reflexively creeped out at the mention of a miniskirt I had worn a few days prior. "Oh, nothing. I just really liked it a lot." When I got out of the elevator, he got off on the same floor and was walking past as I took out my keycard to unlock the door to my room. At 4 a.m. that morning, I woke up with a startle, only to register that there was a man standing silently at the foot of my bed, a man in a security guard uniform, the one from the elevator. As he saw me wake up, he stammered something about my door not being locked properly and ran out of the room. I was still groggy with sleep and didn't fully register what had just happened. A moment after he ran out, I became aware I was lying on my back with covers around my ankles. I sleep nude, but never kick my covers off in my sleep as I was always cold and the AC was on full blast as well. I'm also a very deep sleeper, so someone standing at my bed alone would never stir me. I'm pretty sure him pulling the covers back, causing me to get cold, is what woke me. I am scared to think what could have happened had my friend not been fast asleep in the next bed. Unfortunately, as I was creeped out in the elevator and had avoided making eye contact or looking at his face, and as it was so dark I couldn't have identified him in the room, I never bothered to report it to the hotel. I still regret that, years later.